Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I sat up in bed, feeling rather startled. I'd heard a strange, rather peculiar noise. But what was it? Granted, my home was old. The floorboards creaked and groaned. I'd been warned about old houses before, when I'd purchased the place. My father had apprised me that old houses make noises. It could be the pipes, he told me. It could be absolutely anything, even the foundations itself. My best friend Bella had informed me that she would never ever have invested in an older house, as they are so quick to fall apart, need a lot of regular maintenance, whereas something new was so much more reliable, less likely to let you down. Maybe she was right, because one thing was for certain, that since I'd moved into this old Victorian home, I wasn't getting a wink of sleep. I sat up and could hear the sound again. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded as if something was moving around the house, shifting or dragging hefty furniture across the floor. It was an unsettling feeling that caused tingles of apprehension to glide down my spine like electric sparks. I had a prodigious sense that I wasn't alone. I began to shiver. It was unusually cold in my bedroom, so I walked to the hall and in cupboard. I got myself a blanket. It was odd to be this cold, I thought, at this time of the year. But then again, did not old houses have a notorious reputation for being draughty? I glanced out of my bedroom window that overlooked the ribbon of asphalt that ran down the centre of our street, where the detached houses on both sides of the road were steeped in darkness, as all the lights were off, with the exception, of course, of the street lights. It was all very quiet out there, almost too quiet, as if I was looking at a still photograph of a street where everything was unmoving. Even the trees stood ominously still, like statues of marble, without a single branch blowing even slightly. I closed the creamy curtains of my bedroom, climbing back into bed, finally managing to fall fast asleep. I awoke to find the bright, welcoming, soft light of the early morning streaming through an open crack in the curtains. I eagerly pulled the curtains back on their railings to invite the twinkling morning light to caress my bedroom in shafts of sunlight. It was a blissfully beautiful summer's day. The whole street seemed to have become animated and alive. I could see two little kids with bicycles riding down the road, screaming out to each other, laughing jubilantly. There was an old woman walking her fluffy white dog down the shaded pavement, where the honey locust trees framed each side of the road. I chuckled to myself. What was I like? By all accounts it was a glorious day today, but at night I allowed my imagination to run away with me. What was I thinking? What was wrong with me, I wondered. There was nothing wrong with this house at all. It was just old. That is all it could be accused of. To all intensive purposes, at night I became acutely aware of all the noises that during the day were possibly overshadowed, obscured and drowned out by the daytime sounds of traffic, Honking car horns, animated children's voices, birds tweeting, dogs barking, radios blaring, and buses slamming down their brakes. It was only when I trotted down the sweeping staircase to the downstairs studio, which I had transformed into a shop floor, to display my eclectic, vintage, exceptionally high-quality collection of young designer clothes, that I stopped dead in my tracks. Had someone been in here last night, I wondered, as two of the clothes mannequins that had been on display in the far corner of the shop were now standing in the middle of the oakwood floor, facing each other, as though engaged in a private conversation. What the heck, I thought. How on earth did that happen? Was I losing my mind? For how did two mannequins get into the middle of the floor like this? Someone had to have moved them, but who? I heard a key being thrust into the lock. The shop door opened. The bell tinkled. "What's the matter?" asked my friend Bella, who had just opened the door. She was standing there in the doorway, jiggling her keys, which she then put into her purse. "You're looking as white as a ghost. Are you sure you're all right?" I was about to answer her when she pointed to the two mannequins. "Why on earth did you put the two mannequins in the middle of the floor like that? They take up far too much space. Didn't you like the display that we did yesterday? I thought it was rather good myself." "So you didn't move them?" I asked her. "Absolutely not. Why would I do a thing like that?" "But someone moved them," I said, "and it wasn't me. And then if it wasn't you, who was it?" For a moment we stared at each other in bewilderment, none of us saying a word. But then we shrugged our shoulders, got on with our jobs, as there was an awful lot we needed to do. In half an hour's time we would be opening our doors for the first time to the public, so we needed to get everything ship-shape. First impressions were everything, so representing our shop in the right way to our customers was very significant. Since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, it had been my quintessential dream to own my own clothes boutique. For many years now, I had my eye on this particular old Victorian house as the place to display my designer collections that I was eager to promote. I had been drawn to this house from when I was a little girl, promising myself that one day in the not-too-distant future I would definitely own it. I was going to call it Nirvana, for that is about as close to heaven as you can get, and all my clothes were going to be heavenly. When the Victorian house had fortuitously come on the market, I'd ended up with the exact asking price for the property in my bank account, the money left to me by an obscure distant Canadian relative that I'd never had the privilege to meet. I mean, how does that even happen? You providently, randomly get exactly the right amount of cash for the very thing you've been wanting to buy all your life, which comes onto the market at exactly the right time. Of course I'd snapped it up expediently, put in an offer which had been felicitously accepted at once. My father had told me that he believed it was serendipitous, that I was favoured and predestined to own the property. I was starting to believe he was absolutely, unequivocally right. I knew from a shrewd business perspective it would be ideal, much more financially astute and savvy, to live upstairs in the Victorian home, break down the dividing walls of the ground floor, to transform it into an open-plan interior space where I would create my boutique, but leaving a kitchenette and cloakroom for easy accessibility for both customers and staff. The Victorian house was situated in a perfect area outside of Seattle, close to other eclectic shops, cafes, restaurants, and people's residential homes. I had a few young designers on my books who were creating unique prototype outfits for sale, many inspired by the fabulous clothes worn on the series Downton Abbey, as the exquisite clothes worn on that program had influenced the young designers to create fabulously elegant, feminine, one-of-a-kind creations, and our hanging racks were filled with their inspirational, vibrant designs that were much more affordable for people looking to buy a stunning designer outfit for that quintessential special occasion, without having to crucify their bank accounts in the process. I could feel the effervescent bubbles of anticipation fizzing through me, rather like a bottle of champagne. I walked over the gleaming polished oakwood floors in my high heels, wearing a pretty designer frock, to promote our creations. I turned the sign over in the door window to read open. I shivered in excited anticipation as me and my friend Bella stood behind the reception desk with flutes of celebratory champagne in our hands and extra glasses on hand for all our customers to enjoy a glass. We stood behind the old-fashioned cash register, waiting for the customers to arrive. It would seem we didn't have to wait for very long, as soon a plethora of cars were parking on the red brick parking bay, and curious, inquisitive customers were walking through our boutique door, welcomed always with a glass of champagne. Soon excited, enthused customers were eagerly skimming through our racks of clothes, and on the first day money was quickly exchanging hands, which wasn't bad for a brand new shop now open to the public. We received an enthusiastic, rapturous reception from all the shoppers, assuring us that our clothes were utterly gorgeous, our prices affordable. That was what we wanted to hear. But some were describing us as their new best-kept secret. Over the next few months, things went exceedingly well for us at the boutique. Business was booming. Indeed, it appeared we were doing a roaring trade. I was absolutely thrilled. We had also acquired some new young proficient designers on our books, hoping to develop a name for themselves with some of their consummate new creations. I'd also introduced a range of luxuriously creamy homemade soaps with fabulous natural scents, from lavender to orange blossom and rose, along with heavenly body care products. Then there were glass cabinets filled with fantabulous designer jewellery on display, twirling racks filled with dandy earrings, hair jewellery, bangles that were great for people to purchase as bonny gifts for friends for those quintessential special occasions like birthdays and Christmas. I was pleased with the general layout of the shop. It looked very professional with its gleaming oak floors, baskets filled with interesting products to buy, and stunning classic displays. By all accounts, Bella, my best friend, who had come into business with me, was really thrilled with how things had panned out. She had been the one who had initially had huge reservations and was highly dismissive of my buying an old Victorian house to transform into a boutique. But now she had radically changed her mind, saying that our boutique had character, pizzazz and charm. It seemed to naturally, rather enchantingly draw people to it like a magnet, as it was in such a prime location. Yet despite everything, there were incredulous outer-worldly things that happened in the boutique that could not be rationally explained. Sometimes we would find the faucets in the kitchen would be running on their own, or a cabinet would be left wide open, when moments before it had definitely been shut. There were a handful of times that the mannequins in the shop would be found displayed in the middle of the shop floor, facing each other, as though engaging in a chat, when I came down in the morning. "So what?" Bella had said. "So this place has a ghost. Big deal. As far as I'm concerned, it only adds to the charm and to the mystique of the place, doesn't it?" "You really think the shop has a ghost?" I'd asked her, looking perturbed. "Of course, silly," said Bella, contorting her face in a funny expression. "I mean, what other explanation could there possibly be? How on earth do the mannequins end up in the middle of the floor?" "Something or someone is putting it there, and if it's not you or it's not me, who is it? It's got to be supernatural." She made me laugh as she said this, because she put on a spooky voice. But then, was she right? Could the shop really be haunted? I had no experience of all things that supposedly go bump in the night. But then ignorance is bliss. My friend's words hit me hard. A ghost, I thought. I didn't feel comfortable with the very idea. But was she right? What else could it possibly be? Still, if the ghost was only messing around with us a little, what did we have to concern ourselves with, I told myself. Isn't it better to let sleeping dogs lie? I had already acquired the useful habit of promptly dismissing any strange sounds that I heard at night. I had swiftly learnt to acclimatise to them all, as often people from the country who move to the city find it very hard to adapt to the sounds of traffic on the roads in the beginning, don't they? But then slowly and surely, gradually they begin to adapt. Then they soon fail to even notice the sound of traffic at all, that initially annoyed them so much. A similar thing was happening in my own home. As soon the abnormal, uncommon events were becoming so normal to me that when the peculiarities arose, I barely even batted an eyelid or even flinched. But then, in a trice, the strange things in the boutique began to escalate quite significantly and became a lot less easy to ignore or brush under the carpet, so to speak. One night I woke up with a start. I could distinctly detect the low mumble of two very distinct voices, one low and raspy, the other light and musical. It sounded like a man and a woman having a contemptuous argument or disagreement about something. I grew slightly alarmed. I thought there were two people in my house. I cautiously climbed out of bed, reaching for my dressing gown and slippers. I could hear the raised voices were coming from the spare bedroom that used to be the main bedroom in the house, but I chose not to sleep there, as the views over the front yard were not nearly as alluring. My bedroom overlooked a scattering of trees, including the street, where I could see all the comings and goings of the locals, but this one didn't have a great view. I put my ear to the main bedroom door. The voices were much louder. They were definitely coming from inside the bedroom. I tried to hear what they were saying, but they were muffled, as if the words, although sharp and raised, were clipped by an obscurity, almost like a radio frequency of sorts, that is somewhat bleary. I opened the door, and as suddenly as I did this, the man and woman's voice just stopped at once, as if they had been rudely interrupted by my presence. I closed the door behind me, and waited a while in the passage. Sure enough, like clockwork, the arguing started up all over again. But once again, when I opened the door, the voices stopped immediately. It was an airy, haunting feeling. I walked into the bedroom. I swear I could smell a woman's perfume. It was Lily of the Valley. I would know that smell anywhere. "Is there anyone here?" I asked, walking around the bedroom, opening the closets to inspect them, and finally sitting on the very grandiose queen-size bed that was swathed in an emerald green comforter and a scattering of golden green cushions. I promise you the room suddenly went Arctic cold. I heard the swishing of a long Victorian bustle skirt walking across the floorboards, and a woman's stifled giggle. I sensed she was laughing at me like a kid hiding from you in the closet, trying desperately not to giggle, but then everything went terribly silent. I felt as if I was being watched by more than two pairs of eyes. It really did unnerve me. I decided not to tell Bella about what had transpired. It was one thing for her to be nonchalant and indifferent about a ghostly resident in our boutique, but if I told her that the erroneous activity was on the increase, it might start to scare her, so I decided things were best left unsaid. One day she asked me if she could move into the Victorian house with me. "My landlord's giving me a hard time," she explained. "Go on, it would be fun, the two of us living together. Besides, it makes perfect sense, my living above the boutique. It would be terribly convenient. I mean, you don't have a boyfriend, so it wouldn't be like I was invading your space or imposing. It must get lonely living up here on your own. The two of us would have so much fun together." I must admit I did have my reservations, as I didn't want Bella to be privy to the strange voices I heard coming from the main bedroom at night, so I put her into the other spare bedroom next to mine, and for a while things settled down in the house, so substantially in fact, that I began to doubt whether there had been a ghost at all, or had it all just been the figment of a creative imagination. It's so easy to doubt or second-guess yourself after you've engaged in a paranormal experience of which there appears to be no rational explanation. But one day something happened that was utterly bizarre concerning myself. The worst part of it all is I had no memory of the experience whatsoever. It was my friend Bella who would tell me all about it the following day, and what she shared with me left me feeling more than a little unhinged. What the heck was going on? Should I do something about it or not, I wondered. Bella's account. I was so happy to move into the old Victorian house with my best friend Tina. Suffice to say, in the beginning I had my sceptical misgivings or reservations of her buying the old Victorian residence to convert the lower floor into a boutique. But heads up to her, it most certainly worked. The end result was a phenomenal, inspiration-looking vintage shop that oozed character, style, individuality, and one-of-a-kind designer creations. In the beginning, I'd always found the house disturbingly creepy. I had actively encouraged Tina to buy something more modern, but her heart was so set on buying the Victorian residence. But heads up to her, it really worked. The end result was phenomenal. It was an inspirational, vintage-looking shop that oozed character, style, individuality, and one-of-a-kind designer creations. In the beginning, I'd always found the house to be disturbingly creepy. I'd actively encouraged Tina to buy something more modern, but her heart was so set on buying the Victorian house. I must say I could see why she was so beguiled and enamoured by the property, as it began to grow on me, rather like a random stranger you meet that you unequivocally decide you really don't like in the beginning. And then for some bizarre reason they grow on you. A while later you can't comprehend why you never liked them in the beginning. It was rather like that for me. After she opened up the boutique to the public, the shop was just so delightful. It had that old world feeling about it. You felt when you entered the boutique as if you'd entered another time in our history. I could almost see Lady Mary from Downton Abbey visiting the boutique to buy another one of her fabulous dresses. The fashion in the Nirvana boutique was unique, as each special dress was only one of a kind, made by a creative designer. It seemed to marry well with the boutique. The best part of it all was that the customers were loving the stellar creations, saying that no one makes clothes this stunning anymore. And of course they were right, because they absolutely don't. The unsurpassed clothing ranges were practically growing legs, walking off the shelves, so we were raking in the money, which made us feel very happy and accomplished. Our vision for the place had flourished like a tree in spring filled with bountiful blooms. I wholeheartedly admit that I'd never been happy to live solo in the Victorian house, as the ghostly activity would be more than a little intimidating for me. But sharing the house with my best friend Tina made me feel secure, knowing that I was in very good company. If there was something going on in the house, at least I wasn't on my own. In the beginning, I'm glad to report that I saw no sight or sound of anything anomalous in the house, but one night something very peculiar happened with my best friend Tina that was exceedingly bizarre. Indeed, it was so peculiar that it almost got me to ask myself whether I had dreamed the whole thing up. But it had really happened. But why? That was the $1,001 question I had to ask myself. Why? I woke up in my bed with a start after hearing a thumping noise coming from the first floor. It sounded as if furniture was being dragged across the boutique. What the hell was going on? I cautiously crept down the sweeping staircase, rather worried that someone had broken into the shop to steal our designer clothes. But who should I see heaving the mannequins across the shop floor but Tina herself? I was about to say, "What on earth are you doing?" when I became mindfully aware that Tina was fast asleep. She was sleepwalking. She appeared to be acting incongruously, as if she was not in her right state of mind. My mother had always warned me not to wake someone up when they were walking in their sleep. But I kid you not when I say that Tina thrust the front door open, and gusts of cool, icy air came blowing into the shop, accompanied by a few stray leaves. Tina began to march enigmatically out of the front door, down the pavement and the front yard lawns of the street, owned by many of the residential properties. She was wearing her flimsy pale pink pyjamas, and walking bare feet across the ground, while I followed closely behind her. Even the pronounced, elegant way that Tina was walking was not like her normal walk. Without wishing to be too unkind, Tina's regular walk is, let's just say, very fast-paced and almost masculine. She tends to swing her arms backwards and forwards an awful lot. She looks as if she's in a tearing hurry and is running awfully late for an appointment. Luckily I had the foresight to grab a torch that hangs on a hook next to the front door, so is easily accessible for convenient use. I also left the door of the shop closed, but not locked, so all you need to do to re-enter the shop is give it a push. I switched on the torch, although to be fair, there were street lights on, so the visibility wasn't too obscure. I decided to follow her, and I did. I wanted to see where she would go in this altered state of mind. Lo and behold, she walked over to the little church at the end of the street, crossing the front yard speedily, moving towards the rear. She headed towards an old neglected family burial spot in the backyard, where the old withered, bedraggled, arc-shaped stone graves were so weathered by the hands of time that the names had faded into obscurity. The stones were covered in a plethora of moss and lichen. Tina walked towards the little grave there, the smallest of all the graves, which looked like a child's burial plot. She fell onto her knees, stroking the grave adoringly with her hands. She began to sob like a mother who was grieving over the loss of her child. But even her mannerisms and the curious way she was behaving was not like the Tina I was acquainted with, but more like someone else with much more graceful feminine mannerisms, not even common in today's society. I stood there watching my friend sobbing. All of a sudden she straightened her clothes, composing herself, getting up and walking straight back to the boutique, pushing the door wide open so that the bell jingled. She walked up the staircase back to her bedroom. I saw her climbing into bed and going right back to sleep as if nothing had ever happened. What the heck, I thought. What on earth is going on? I was very disquieted by the whole experience, not being able to make any sense of it at all. The next morning when Tina woke up, she claimed that she had had a weird, very lucid dream. She told me she had dreamt she was a Victorian woman called Alice, whose beloved little child called Philip had died of dysentery. It felt so real, she told me. I kept going to the old church to visit the graveyard there, to grieve the loss of my beloved son. When I told Tina that she had visited the graveyard at the old church at the bottom of our street the previous night, in the middle of her sleep, at first she didn't believe me, but she soon discovered the bottom of her feet were filthy, that she had stray dried leaves stuck in her hair, while her pink pyjamas were scuffed and dirty. She was appalled when I told her that she'd been moving the mannequins herself across the boutique floor. Could she have been the one who had shifted the mannequins on the first night that she spent at the Victorian house, remembering not a thing? It would explain why they appeared to have moved themselves. Tina assured me that she had heard dragging sounds across the floor of the boutique that night, and was absolutely convinced that on that specific occasion she was not responsible for reorganizing the mannequins. I could tell poor Tina was very distressed that I'd caught her sleepwalking, visiting a gravesite in the dead of night. She was insistent that she had never sleptwalked a day in her life, so why was it happening to her now? It was like she'd been acting out her dream, as a Victorian lady from another time, grieving the loss of her child. I couldn't help wondering if she'd been taken over by the ghost of a Victorian woman, who may have lived in the house at one time, and momentarily taken possession of Tina's body. It seemed to me like a credible explanation. I'm glad to say, as soon as the sleepwalking had started, it appeared to stop, so we both thought it was a once-off experience that was unlikely to ever happen again. Tina did, however, keep on dreaming about the Victorian woman Alice, and experiencing the haunting loss of her son, that she exclaimed felt so real that she'd wake up with a deep, unfathomable depression, and a sense of hopelessness that she could not shake off easily. It was all-consuming, and appeared to have attached itself to her like a blood-sucking leech. But during the day, when we were attending to our customers, the heaviness always lifted off her. One night I was the one to wake up to the sound of ghostly voices coming from one of the spare bedrooms that used to be the main bedroom in the house. Tina had failed to confide in me about the ghostly activity that went on in that room. I remember thinking, what the heck is that? I stood outside the door of the bedroom, distinctly hearing a woman's voice saying, "Help Alice find peace! Help Alice find peace!" I opened up the door, but there was no one there. But the room smelt distinctly of Lily of the Valley. I was so spooked that I hightailed it back to my bedroom as quickly as possible. One night Tina began to sleepwalk all over again. This time I'm glad to say she did not start shifting the mannequins across the boutique floor, but she walked towards the door of the shop, twisting the key in the lock, undoing the latch, and physically jerking the door open, while she was fast asleep. Once again she was out onto the street, walking towards the old church. Thank God for the street lights. That's all I can say. It was a tenebrous night, and without those street lights accompanied by the light of my torch, goodness knows I don't think I'd have had the guts to follow Tina, so I'm glad I did. Tina had told me that if she ever got into a sleepwalking state again, that despite my misgivings, I absolutely had to wake her up. I ran over to her, thinking that this sleepwalking business was seriously getting out of hand. I tried to get her attention, and began to shake her vigorously. "Tina! Tina, wake up! Tina, wake up!" Tina turned around to look directly at me, but the eyes that were looking at me did not appear to be Tina's. They seemed almost glazed over. A strange woman's voice came out of her mouth, a beautiful posh woman's voice that said to me, "Tina's not here at the moment. She's otherwise engaged." And then she walked deliberately towards the cemetery. Once again Tina walked like a very graceful Victorian woman, It was almost like this Victorian woman had completely taken over her body. I was sure that this was the case. I followed cautiously behind her, thinking that the least I could do was to keep a beady eye on my best friend, making sure she returned to bed safe and sound. I mean, what else could I do for her? Call emergency services, tell them that my best friend appeared to be walking the streets in a catatonic state, in a drug-like stupor, as she proceeded to act out her dream. I'm sure that revelation would have gone down with them like a lead balloon. They'd probably be thinking I was the one needing help, as I'd clearly lost my marbles. I have to say this was not a pleasant night, for it had a menacing ambience about it that was disturbingly unsettling. My first inclination was to run back to the house, bury myself beneath my covers, but with my best friend seemingly possessed by a Victorian woman, I had to keep my eyes firmly on her. I'm used to nights here in Washington State, as I've lived here all my life. Let me assure you that they're usually very pleasant and agreeable, but not this time. For a start, the crickets and frogs that grace us with their presence every night in this part of the world had decided that they weren't going to perform this evening, so everything was unusually quiet, apart from a soft breeze blowing through the trees, making those honey locust trees jiggle in the wind. It was very disquieting, because I felt as if I was being watched by hundreds of pairs of eyes. Even the trees seemed to morph into humanoid entities, although that was an impression and not a reality. I kept my eyes pinned on Tina, watching her every move. Once again she went through the repetitive familiar routines, going to the back of the graveyard, caressing the tiny gable-shaped stone that lay in the middle of the two large stones that were so weathered by age, time, and the unkind, formidable elements of nature. She began to weep as though grieving the loss of a beloved child. I stood there watching in bewilderment, as if I was a producer watching a screenplay, accessing the performance. By now I was absolutely certain the ghost of a Victorian woman was definitely possessing my friend's body. That was when my attention was drawn to a tall line of Douglas fir trees that fringed the outer perimeters of the cemetery, sprawling out into a large woodgrove at the back of the church that was all owned by the church, and in the years to come would sadly be bulldozed for church extensions. Something was moving through the trees, a dark shadow, a creature that was tall and distinct. I knew at once what it was. My little 10-year-old brother Kirk, who still resides at my family home in Seattle, was addicted to the subject of Bigfoot. His bedroom was littered with Bigfoot regalia. My parents thought his preoccupation with the fictitious beast was really rather endearing. My mother had insisted that, much like the subject of Father Christmas, that we could never tell him that Bigfoot was a creature from myth and legend. But was he? I didn't know what to think. My liberal parents, who based everything on scientific fact, thought they were so clever and absolutely knew everything there was to know about everything. My parents are the audacious kind of people that are always right, never ever wrong, so help me God. I had learnt from a very young age, even when I discerned that they were wrong about something, I'd better not argue with them. I'd never win an argument. How would they feel now if they were to see this creature that was moving towards me, so obviously a Bigfoot? It was beyond question or doubt. Would they deny what their eyes were seeing, I pondered? Would they even lie to themselves? For if they did not, then their paradigm of the world would almost certainly be shifted, and that would not be a comfortable place for them to be. As I was reflecting over these very thoughts, the creature had moved towards me. My mind and thoughts were absent of all emotion. Even fear was not coursing through my veins, telling me to run. Wasn't that supposed to happen, I thought? Where was my adrenaline when it needed recruitment? Had it abandoned me in the flight and fight response? Was I not supposed to be terribly afraid? Yet as I stood there in this incongruous, surreal, outer-worldly moment, I eyeballed it all, drinking in everything, as if I was tasting a long, refreshing, icy alcoholic cocktail, and meditating on all the different flavours, like the lemongrass, mint, grapefruit, pineapple juice, vodka, or like a thirsty sea sponge on a sandy beach, lapping it all up, absorbing the strange scene unfolding before my very eyes. I don't think the Bigfoot noticed me, as I stood still, staring at him with gog eyes. It would seem his attention was completely focused on Tina. He stopped dead in his tracks, standing incredibly still, watching her intently, His pyramid-shaped head swiveled from left to right. His deep-set dark eyes homed in on Tina. The expression on his leathery grey face was one of a deeply troubled man. It was almost as if he could discern that Tina was possessed by some outer-worldly phenomenon. He didn't seem to like it one bit. He glided intentionally towards Tina, confidently, without reservation or any kind of reticence whatsoever. The Bigfoot was bending over my friend's body. That was when I suddenly almost bounced back into my reality, with the buoyancy of a beach ball. Now I did feel fear. Oh my God, was this huge, anomalous, ambiguous creature going to hurt Tina? Please God, no. I wanted to scream, but no words came out of my mouth. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My body failed to fire on all cylinders like a car with a dead battery that won't start up. Soon I stood there like a solid ice statue at a cocktail banquet, frozen in time, watching the enigmatic scene unfold, almost like someone bewitched by a horror movie that they don't want to be watching at all, but they just can't help themselves. It was like I'd been sucked into the surreal moment with the inability to influence it in any way. Like a producer of a film set whom has already finalized the movie's ending. The outcome was already preordained in the passage of time, it would seem. The Bigfoot slapped Tina's cheeks, as if he was trying to wake up a person that was half-wasted or half-cut from their inebriated state. Tina did not respond to those slaps at all, although I did discern the whites of her eyes rolled back in their sockets. The Bigfoot roared in her face. The scream he emitted was of such a high vibrational frequency, it would almost certainly have made glass break. It was a sound that went right through me, and that was when Tina woke up. I knew that I was seeing my friend. She looked so nonplussed, confused, disorientated. I couldn't blame her, really, as she sat up in the graveyard, perusing her inscrutable surroundings. The look on her face was incredibly illuminating. It was like she was saying, "Where the hell am I? And what am I doing sitting in a graveyard at the dead of night? And why is there a Bigfoot eyeballing me, with a very troubled look on his face? What on earth is going on? Is this some kind of horrifying dream?" Tina's account. In my very lucid dream, I saw myself as a Victorian woman. I was wearing a long flowing black dress, and a long black veil over my face, suggesting I was in mourning. I glanced down at my dress, admiring how pretty it was. They didn't make dresses like this in our time. I glanced briefly at my reflection in the mirror, and thought I looked pleasingly pretty, although my dark ringleted hair was swept back from my face. But I wasn't looking at me that I knew well. I wasn't the Tina who ran a boutique. In my dream I was completely different, someone from another time. I knew my name was Alice. I recall thinking that I would have looked a whole lot more attractive if I didn't have such horrible huge black rings under my eyes, and if my eyes didn't look so red. Then I remembered the pain and the hopelessness I was feeling. I was in mourning. Over 3 days ago my precious son had died. My whole world had been torn apart, shredded into thousands of pieces. My husband had also been grieving, but not like me, for losing my son was like losing a part of myself. I felt as if I also died. People had been so kind, but no one really understood a mother's maternal love. I felt as if my insides had been ripped apart, as if the very breath from my lungs had been siphoned out of my soul. Losing my son had been like an internal tsunami, devastating the inner functionings of my very being, for even the mechanics of my physical body, or my internal plumbing, had gone awry. The doctor had informed my husband that I needed time, and that every time I felt sad or queasy, I should take a whiff of the smelling salts that he had provided for me. They would help to settle my nerves. He told my husband I would be as right as rain, that time was the greatest healer of all, and I would get better very soon. But I knew he was absolutely wrong. I'd never be better again. My husband had been asking me where I was going, as he saw me moving towards the front door, with an obstinate tenacity and urgency. I told him I was returning to our family plot at the church. I wanted to be by the little grave, to be close to my son, but he wasn't happy with me at all. I could see his expression was very disapproving. He took my hand in his and lifted it to his lips, kissing it, and saying to me,
My dearest, it is not in your interest to keep visiting the grave. You cannot dwell on your grievous loss. None of us can. It is not good for the heart. But I pushed him away. I continued on my exigent journey to the graveyard. Nobody was ever going to stop me being away from my son. Not even death could separate me from him. It seemed strange that as I pushed past my husband, it was the morning, but now it appeared to be night. But I didn't care. The confusion didn't worry me at all. I had to get to the graveyard now, and the sooner the better. Nothing was ever going to stop me. The urgency I felt was pronounced and all-consuming. I needed to be near my son. Relief overwhelmed me as I drew close to the family plot, kneeling down next to my son's grave, and I began to sob and sob and sob. The pain flooding through me was unlike anything I've ever experienced. The next thing I knew was that something was slapping my face. I heard this god-awful roar. I woke up to find myself in a graveyard, staring up into the eyes of a Bigfoot. This couldn't be happening to me. My dream had now morphed into a nightmare, but the nightmare seemed more real than a dream. How was that possible? I was no longer the Victorian lady in my dream, but Tina, who owned a Victorian house that was converted into a boutique. The Bigfoot took a couple of steps away from me. He walked backwards, but he watched me all the while. His eyes seemed kind and very concerned. He was non-threatening, and he wasn't aggressive. His leathery face was so incredibly human. The creature was about 7 foot tall, covered in long flowing hair. It took one more look at me, and then turned around and glided away. I pinched myself and realized that I was very much wide awake. But what the hell was I doing in a graveyard? But I had done this before, had I not? I had been warned about this. That was when I realized that Bella was standing there staring at me, as if I was a strange specimen in a zoo. "I can't believe it," she said, running up to me and giving me an effusive hug. "Do you realize that the Bigfoot we've just seen got you out of your trance-like state? It was like he knew you were being possessed by something outer-worldly. I was not able to wake you up myself. Believe me, I tried, but the voice that came out of your mouth was not yours." It was a posh, eloquent female voice. It would seem that after my outlandish encounter with the hairy man, otherwise known as Bigfoot, the activity in our boutique ground to a stop. I never dreamed about the Victorian woman ever again. She was completely gone from my life. But when I looked back at the historic archives on the property that I had purchased, I soon discovered there was a woman called Alice who lived in our home. She had put weights on her feet, jumping into the lake, soon after her son Philip tragically died of dysentery, as the stress of losing her son had completely overwhelmed her. I knew how she felt, for when she took over my body, I had become one with her. So I know what it feels like to lose a child, even though I've never had kids myself. But for a while, I was her. It was the strangest thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life. I am of the humble opinion that Bigfoots understand the world of spirits, for this strange creature certainly extinguished the Victorian woman from my life. But I can only hope she found her peace and was reunited with her son on the other side. I will say the Victorian house now feels airier and lighter than ever. The place is steeped in such a happy energy these days. I live in the house and have turned my business into an online boutique. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Angelica drove up to the large black wrought iron gates of the exclusive upmarket hunting lodge, designed for people with deep pockets, her heart beginning to miss a beat, for this sumptuous place looked grandiose, luxuriously swank. This was not what she would have expected or even anticipated. Granted, she thought it would be upmarket, but not in a league like this. The guard studied her curiously, almost as if he thought she looked out of place, as if in some way she wasn't glamorous enough to be driving through these gates in her run-down car that looked as if it was about to fall apart in any given moment. "What is your name?" the guard asked her. "I need to check if you're on the interview list." "It's Angelica Asher," I told him. "Ah, yes, there your name is," he said. "Please will you sign on the dotted line?"
which is what she did. Then he proceeded to take down her car registration number before the gates finally opened to allow her car entry. All this fuss, she thought, over an interview. I'm not visiting Buckingham Palace, for goodness sake, nor am I hiding the crown jewels in my trunk. The way that guard was looking at me, you'd think he thought I was about to hold up the Queen in her powder room. I'm sorry, sir, if you're not used to run-down cars gracing your driveway, but just because I'm not rich doesn't mean I'm a natural criminal, she said under her breath. She drove down the long asphalt drive, neatly lined with red brick, observing the pristine fields of perfectly manicured grass, peppered with trees, marvelling at how the upper-class aristocratic lodge looked like a luxuriously pristinely maintained park, much like the likes of Central Park in New York. She drove past a meadow with black and bay horses frolicking happily in a field, along with a beautiful lake fringed by weeping willows, whose boughs of green leaves dangled gracefully over the gleaming silvery surface that twinkled brightly in the morning sun. There were cat's tails by the lake, along with a handful of rambunctious berry bushes growing wildly on the edge, heavily laden with ripe juicy berries. Then she saw the hunting lodge, and gasped in awe. It wasn't your usual wooden-style lodge. It looked more like a huge Georgian-style mansion, painted in white with a grandiose arched pale blue front door, very symmetrical large windows, and a spectacular courtyard framed by manicure hedges and dozens of white roses, along with terracotta pots filled with bright red hanging geraniums. As she parked on the luxurious brick driveway, shaded by towering mature oak trees, her heart sank in her chest, for her dilapidated car looked like it belonged on a rubbish tip, as all the other cars in the lot were SUVs and Land Rovers that were worth a bob or two. To make matters worse, there were 2 Rolls-Royces and a Bentley parked in the far corner. In that moment, Angelica's self-consciousness grew exponentially. She felt humiliated, because her scrap of a car was an insult. Still, it couldn't be helped, she thought, pursing her lips together tightly, straightening her back and holding her head up proud and tall. How many people were applying for this very same position, she wondered, her heart sinking all the more. Wasn't this overkill? When she finally was seated in the reception area, she marvelled at the grandness of this place, for it was as glitzy, palatial, and as grand as the Trump Hotel that she had stayed in once with her family in Las Vegas. The mansion was fabulously ornate. Everything sparkled, twinkled, and shone within an inch of its life. She was certain you'd have to scour the entire place with a fine tooth comb before you found even a speck of dust or a wispy cobweb anywhere. There were incredible glass chandeliers dangling from the high ceiling that looked like they had cost a fortune, marble floors, a huge sweeping embellished staircase in the far end of the foyer, with very elaborate wrought-iron balustrades, sophisticated oak-wood desks and coffee tables covered with ornate Ming vases filled with extravagant flower arrangements. Lavish, ostentatious rugs were flung across the floor, while the minimalistic white walls were covered with colourful, affluent-looking, flamboyant contemporary art pieces, obviously done by highly sought-after artists, along with the occasional white-tailed deer head, mule deer head, elk, bison, zebra, black bear, mountain lion, and an even African lion head, all mounted on the walls. She did wonder why the hunting lodge had a zebra and lion on the wall. Because that represented Africa, didn't it? Maybe it was to give the place an international feel, she thought. Angelica felt as if their glassy, taxidermal eyes were staring at her. She took a seat on a very long, verbose, L-shaped, dark brown velvety sofa in the reception area, dappled with turquoise and gold cushions, where 10 other eager applicants were sitting with crossed legs, waiting in eager anticipation for their names to be called. It was clear that these young girls were all applying for the same job, which was a huge bummer. But then what did she expect? That somehow she was going to be handed the job without going through any loopholes or challenges? The real world didn't work that way. Everything was about selling yourself and your accomplishments to your prospective employer. Nothing was ever easy. Angelica surreptitiously compared the hopeful applicants to herself privately, and then she concluded she would never in a million years get this job, for she could see the glowing curriculum vitas the girls were carrying in brown envelopes clearly looked impressive, but she had no work experience behind her, apart from working as a waitress for a couple of years,
but she reckoned that that did not count for much. Neither did she have a fancy car parked in the lot. She felt exceedingly intimidated, daunted, and rather overawed by the young professional-looking women that were all applying for the same position. So she decided that she would leave, with a job that clearly was not hers for the taking. Why would someone like her, driving a clapped-out car, ever be employed in such an ostentatious place like this? What was she smoking? Or what planet was she living on, she wondered. No, this job was not for her. She was sure of it. It had to be given to someone who was indirectly related to Jackie Kennedy down the family line. But her? No, forget it. It wasn't going to happen. And if it did, she'd eat her hat. And she meant that quite literally. She didn't normally have such a defeatist, killjoy, fatalistic and pessimistic attitude, but in this case she felt resigned to the fact that she was overshadowed by these rather accomplished, proficient young ladies who had worked as venue coordinators for various other rather grand establishments. She sighed with frustration, was about to leave when her name was called by the man in reception. "Is Angelica Asher here?" She nodded. She was led into an office where a surly woman was sitting behind the desk. The woman was in her late 60s, with white hair swept away from her face, pinned in the back in a very severe, neat, rather formidable bun. The woman's brown raven eyes were piercing and penetrating, as if they were looking right through her like an X-ray machine, which was very unsettling for Angelica, while her matter-of-fact, brisk manner of speaking was very abrupt. "So why have you applied for this position?" she asked Angelica, tapping her pen impatiently on the rosewood desk, as if she'd already had enough of the interview before it had even started. It would seem her cavalier, impetuous, laconic approach revealed very poignantly that patience wasn't exactly her strong point. She liked things finished before they'd even begun. Angelica flushed bright red, firmly deciding she'd be straight with the prickly, slightly fractious woman, for she discerned that this was not the kind of person you could easily deceive, for in Angelica's eyes the shrewd woman was as razor-sharp and ingenious as a raven. "I'll be blunt and to the point," she volunteered. "I need the money. I was scanning through the advertisements. I thought this was a job I could possibly do. In truth, I'm quite efficacious, efficient, competent and good with people, but I'm not feeling that sanguine now," she admitted. "I can see I've got stiff competition out there. To be honest with you, some of those people have impeccable references, have worked at exclusive venues before. Besides, the only car in your parking bay out there that looks like it belongs in a knacker's yard is obviously mine. I don't belong here. I can see that now." What on earth was she doing? She scolded herself privately. You never spoke yourself down about yourself at an interview, especially not here in America, where you're taught to think big all the time. But her frankness came across as refreshing. The woman eyed her curiously. Her stoic, fixed expression changed fleetingly, almost like a grey overcast sky, becoming lighter. "It's exhilarating and refreshing that you're so incredibly honest, my dear. But if I could give you a word of practical advice, I'd tell you not to sell yourself short at an interview. It really isn't a good idea. It never is. And you look like a very bright girl to me, who has a whole lot to offer. So don't downsell yourself. And don't allow yourself to be intimidated by the wealthy. I want to assure you that at one time in my life I also drove a car that, shall we say, was a little shabby. We've all been there at one time. Well, those of us who've had to work from the bottom all the way up, that is. And that's nothing to be ashamed of at all. Do you know what the job involves? Not exactly, but I do imagine it's a bit of everything. That's exactly what it is. A bit of everything. It's a very good way to put it. We have a team of people working here with very specific jobs, but the owner of the lodge, Mrs. Margaret Grayson, needs to hire someone to be rather like an extra on a film set. You'll not be specifically employed for one particular job. Your job will be as variable and as fluctuating as the weather. It'll be one thing one day, another thing the next. Let's just say that some of the jobs you will do will not be conventional or run-of-the-mill. You'll be like a chameleon adapting to every situation. You see, when you work with wealthy, very affluent people who think that they can buy the entire world, sometimes they have more money than sense. Let's just say that some of our guests have extravagant requests, like a woman wanting her dog to be chaperoned all day. In that case, it will be your job to be the chaperone. Or a lonely old man or woman that wants someone to sit with him or her at dinner that night, to keep him company. It might be someone wanting you to follow them around with their hunting gear, or you might be asked to read a child a book for the night, or to look after someone's little girl. Other times you may help wherever you're needed, whether it's in the kitchen, reception, or even cleaning, so it's a little bit like being a jack of all trades. Are you up for a job like that?
Definitely, said Angelica, brightening. I think I'd enjoy that kind of versatile job. Don't they say variety is the spice of life? So how many people do you actually have staying at the lodge at one time? Never more than 12 at a time. The lodge is exclusive. The costs per booking are extremely expensive. So it's our job to offer our guests an exemplary service and a fabulous time. People can book into the lodge for fishing all year round at the lake. Then we have people coming to stay here during the hunting season to try their hand with taking down any kind of animal, from a deer, a moose, a mule deer, an elk, a bison, a bighorn sheep, or even a mountain goat. Depends on what tickles their fancy, really. It sounds like a job I could do, said Angelica. I mean, it's an all-hands-on-deck job, but my bet is you need to use your initiative and get on with whatever needs doing. I imagine after a while it's pretty instinctive. So you think you have initiative, Angelica? Oh, I definitely do, said Angelica. I rarely do. I can't claim to have the kind of dynamic credentials that many of the people out there may have, with their fancy curriculum vitas, but I've worked as a waitress for over 2 years. I'm efficient, honest, reliable, and hard-working. Well, Angelica, thank you for coming. You may see yourself out. We've got your details. We'll be in touch shortly. And don't forget what I said. Please don't sell yourself short. As Angelica left the hunting lodge, she walked past the long line of nervous young women waiting to be interviewed. She knew in her gut that she was already defeated. How could she ever hope to acquire such a prestigious position, with so much seriously threatening competition, all for the same job? While the interviewer had been terribly nice and offered her some encouraging words of wisdom, Angelica knew there were young women here applying for the position with years of experience behind them, working at top venues, experience that she clearly lacked. Angelica knew what competition was like. She'd grown up with 8 brothers and sisters as a young girl. It'd been a struggle to get her mother's undivided, circumspect attention, as her mother was constantly having to appease all her children all the time in her all-consuming job as a mother. It was natural for her siblings to compete for their parents' love, validation, and approval. Growing up with stiff competition between her siblings, it had felt like a losing battle, for it seemed that her mother always gravitated towards 2 children who seamlessly managed to gain her favour. For Angelica, it was not a tightrope that she was willing to walk, as you could so easily slip and fall, and next week another sibling might be her mother's flavour of the week. Growing up, she had learnt that there was always someone prettier, brighter, cleverer, richer, faster than she was, so she decided all you could ever do in life was try your very best. Well, I did all I could do, Angelica told herself, climbing into her battered car and driving away. But if she didn't get this job, it would mean returning to her overcrowded home. She longed for space, freedom, solace, and a measure of independence. To live away from her family home was her greatest desire. She knew the chances of acquiring the job were remote. So imagine how astounded she was to discover that out of that sea of impressive applicants, she was the one that had received the job. She could hardly believe it. Angelica had blended into life at the hunting lodge with an unflawed excellent ease. She was thoroughly enjoying the experience. The lodge was magnificent. The staff quarters in the left wing of the house were utterly luxurious. The woman, Mrs. Nora Madam, who had interviewed her, was the manager in charge of overseeing and controlling all the operations at the hunting lodge. She ran the place with the efficiency, proficiency and efficaciousness, along with the steely grit of a captain of a large ship, with a potent skillfulness that meant she made things look terribly easy, when in fact they were definitely not. Although she was a tough woman, she possessed a rather endearing, benevolent, congenial warmth to her character that Angelica was pleasantly surprised to discover. She had a sharp wit, and could be utterly charming, and was quick to become like a matriarch figure in Angelica's life. One day Mrs. Madam would become to Angelica the mother she never had. Angelica's account in her own words. As Mrs. Madam had warned me, I was to find my job as vacillating, variable and fluctuating as the weather, so in truth I never ever got bored. But some of the demands of the rich and famous could be extreme and over the top, for they would request anything that tickled their fancy, and they weren't afraid to ask for it either, regardless of how over the top it might sound or appear. On one occasion I had to hire a painter to paint the esteemed guest's bedroom lilac. She couldn't abide sleeping anywhere that wasn't adorned in her favourite colour, and in fact she refused to sleep anywhere that wasn't lilac. I had to organise comforters, curtains and accessories for her bedroom to be done in lilac, as well as complementary shades. Luckily I was quite good at interior design, so I managed to transform her room into a stunning suite that was fabulous. We decided to keep it like that for our future guests. I had one elderly female guest called Irma Huxley, who needed her dog to be served fillet steak, poached salmon, chicken or turkey twice a day, with braised vegetables and mashed potato. She was very particular about her dog, a male schnauzer called Mr. Huxley. She told me that after her husband had died, her dog became the new man of the house, and hence his name was Mr. Huxley. I will say this, Mr. Huxley had one of the shiniest, healthiest coats I've ever seen in a dog, and he'd never eaten a drop of kibble a day in his life. In fact, I doubt he even knew what kibble was. Mrs. Huxley boasted to me tirelessly that her vet claimed he was the most salubrious dog he'd ever seen. "I don't understand all these scientific diets, dear," she would exclaim to me, "that insist you give your dogs and cats kibble. Do you know how bad those dry diets are for the kidneys and liver? Too dreadful for words," she tutted. "But these days people will do almost anything to get rich quick, especially those dried food manufacturers, even at the expense of our animals' health. I'll tell you something about this world of ours, dear. Everything is agenda-driven, from the pharmaceutical industry to the food industry. We are fed a bunch of lies in order to be swathed and manipulated to believe what they want us to believe. Never mind the truth. That's irrelevant, dear. All that matters is to make those fat boys in power get even richer and even fatter." Mrs. Huxley wanted me to take her dog for a walk twice a day. She had come to the hunting lodge not to hunt or fish, but just to relax, receive a little pampering from the in-house beauty salon, where she indulged in a plethora of beauty treatments, from massages to exfoliation treatments, wraps, essential oil infusions, and anti-aging procedures. She also read books and went for casual country strolls. She called upon my services regularly when her eyes grew tired, and she wanted someone to read her book for her, and so I did just that. I was beginning to realise that there were no boundaries or limitations in the world of the entitled and the fabulously wealthy, who believed they could pretty much buy anything they wanted for themselves, anything that their hearts desired. I had one woman who literally wanted me to dress her from naked and brush her hair like the lady's maid on Downton Abbey, attending to the likes of Lady Mary. In truth, I didn't mind dressing the poor old woman, but I did ponder on what it was like to be so lazy that you wouldn't even want to pull up your own knickers. If someone were to do such an intimate procedure on me, let's just say I would be more than a little self-conscious, but some people have absolutely no shame. On one occasion I'd gone fishing with an old lady who wanted some company. I'd eaten all my meals with her and been privy to drinking the most expensive French champagne. So my job was exceedingly interesting, and there was never a dull moment. There were, of course, times I was asked to help in reception or clean up someone's bedroom, which was less exciting, of course. One of the most horrifying things that ever happened at the hunting lodge took me a long time to come to terms with. In truth, I'll never forget that day as long as I live. It is indelibly entrenched in my mind and can never be erased. We had an elderly man called Mr. Beard staying at the lodge, in a grand suite with us, who looked much like his name suggests, for he had a rather magnificent Gandalf-like black beard, the kind of beard you can win awards for, I'm told. He also had brown hooded eyes, a very big prominent eagle-like hooked nose, a bald head which he covered with a black bandana all the time. He was visiting the lodge to sharpen his hunting skills and techniques, under the instruction and guidance of one of our consummate teachers. He was here to enjoy hearty, delicious, high-quality food, gastronomic masterpieces created by our illustrious chefs, and casual country strolls in the fabulously beautiful countryside. It was at luncheon the very next day that he was handed the telephone from the waiter. When Frederick the waiter saw the man's brown eyes become watery and his face pale significantly, he knew instinctively that the poor man had had a terrible shock. He could tell when someone had received very bad news. Frederick asked him,
Sir, is everything all right? You look very pale. No, barked Mr. Beard. It most certainly is not all right. If you must know, my wife has just died. The nursing home phoned to tell me. The waiter said to him, I'm very, very sorry, sir. My deepest condolences, sir, for your loss. Is there anything I can possibly do? Yes, there is. Send me a bottle of your finest, most expensive champagne, Frederick, and make it as quick as you possibly can. I wouldn't mind a few chocolate truffles as well while you're about it. Yes, sir. Will that be all? That will be all, said Mr. Beard. But as I said, make it quick. I need it now. Yes, sir, said Frederick. The waiter sent up a bottle of his very best champagne, which seemed an odd thing to have to do after his wife had just died, which made the waiter wonder if he was celebrating the death of his wife by bursting open a bottle of effervescent bubbles. I mean, after all, did you not order the finest champagne for a celebration? Maybe his wife was a dragon, he thought, who had made his life a living hell. A short while later, a huge gunshot was heard going off in the house. It practically shook the mansion limb from limb, rocking the entire mansion as if the house itself was a huge ocean liner that had gone plunging into an iceberg, rather like the Titanic. It was impactful, that gunshot was. I assure you, everyone heard it. I was 2 doors away from the room when it happened, so I instinctively knocked on the door. Mr. Beard! Mr. Beard! Are you all right, Mr. Beard? I then pushed open the door, but there was no sign of Mr. Beard in the bedroom suite, although the television was on and blaring away loudly on the horse-riding channel. Mr. Beard! Mr. Beard, are you in there? There was no answer. I opened the bathroom door. It creaked open very slowly. The room was very steamy and hot. The mirror was covered in mist with the words "I'm sorry" written in the mist. The finished champagne was lying in a tall ice bucket standing right next to the bath. A glass champagne flute lay smashed into hundreds of thousands of pieces on the floor. A white towel had turned bright crimson. Mr. Beard was lying in a bright scarlet pool of his own blood, with the end of a rifle emerging through the water. He was completely naked, having shot himself in the head. There was blood everywhere, along with pieces of brain matter, skull with hair attached to it. It was the most horrific scene that I've ever seen in my life. I screamed and screamed at the top of my lungs in horror of what I was perceiving. It was such a gruesome, macabre, haunting scene from the most graphic nightmare. I remember being very annoyed by the sound of the scream, wondering to myself who the heck was making such a god-awful commotion, and why the hell wouldn't they just shut up, when Mrs. Madam was standing over me, slapping my face. Calm down, she told me. To my horror, I realized that the discomposing "I'm being murdered" kind of scream had come from me. I never knew my lungs were capable of such an atrocious, ear-splitting vocal assault. Suffice to say, I was to learn that the authorities found a note on his desk saying I can't live without my beloved. I'm sorry. Needless to say, Nora Madam was very displeased, irked and disgruntled. I'd go so far as to say she was angry with the bereaved Mr. Beard, feeling very little sympathy for his dreadful plight. She saw his actions as exceedingly selfish and self-centred. If he was going to do this, she said indignantly, why didn't he have the decency to go into the woods with his bottle of champagne and blow his head off in there? Now we have a crime scene in our hunting lodge, she tutted angrily, as Mrs. Madam was a very practical, hands-on woman. This bad publicity is all we need for our hunting lodge, she told me. Imagine if the word gets out about this suicide with Mr. Beard. It could be terribly bad from a business perspective. It could really affect how well we do here in the future. Indeed, the police were called, as was the coroner. The place was covered with crime scene tape. You think it would have put all our guests off, staying in a large mansion where a man had taken his own life. But on the contrary, the people were stirred up with a macabre kind of excitement and curiosity as they watched the scene unfold. It rather reminded me of a horrific accident you see on the highway, where all the cars suddenly begin to slow down so that they can have a quick glimpse of what is going on, as the drivers are gripped by intrigue and curiosity. It was almost certainly like that in our mansion, as the various visitors, from the police inspectors to the coroner and the crime scene cleaners, came and went. It was like a movie scene being reenacted into real life. Our guests just loved it, especially when we were all being interviewed by the police. It was like that fabulously beguiling scene on Murder on the Orient Express, where all the affluent guests are interviewed and examined by the famous esteemed Belgian detective Hercule Poirot about where they were at the time of the murder. I think it made our guests feel very involved, as if they were whisked up in a real-life enthralling murder mystery, only this was a straightforward suicide. I was personally asked by the police inspector what kind of interaction I'd had with Mr. Beard. Did I get the impression he was depressed? Did he ever speak about his sickly wife to me, who had been dying of cancer at the nursing home? Regretfully, I had to say no to all those questions. It appeared that another guest, a man called Mr. Finnegan, who was staying with us, knew more about Mr. Beard than anybody else did. He told the police that his wife was the love of his life, but bone cancer had ravaged her body so badly that he'd come to the hunting retreat for a brief escapism from her, as being around her 24/7, watching her deteriorate and wither away, had been all too much for him. I was the one to ask help redesign the whole suite after Mr. Beard's tragic demise. The whole bathroom had to be gutted, with all its fixtures and fittings discarded. Some of Mr. Beard's blood had seeped beneath the marble tiles of the bathroom floor. Quite literally, the whole room had to be torn apart limb from limb. Mrs. Madden was very disquieted and plagued by the deep concern that anyone hearing about the suicide of Mr. Beard would be put off staying at the lodge. But it would seem no publicity is bad publicity at all. She was even more fretful that no one would want to stay in the suite where Mr. Beard had taken his own life, but she couldn't have been more wrong about that either. On the contrary, business at the hunting lodge boomed like never before. Ironically, the prestigious, extravagant, ornate suite that had been recently refurbished and redecorated, where Mr. Beard had taken his own life, was highly sought after by many of our stinking rich, most plutocratic guests, who specifically booked the room where the suicide had occurred, confessing that they hoped to see Mr. Beard's ghost, for it would seem it was as close as their moneyed pockets would buy them a night in a luxurious haunted mansion, so to speak, so the excitement of this possibility became electric for them. It was all really rather bizarre. We did have one guest who claimed that the ghost of Mr. Beard had been standing over her bed. I'd never seen anyone so excited, riveted or animated as she was when telling everybody her astounding account, right down to all the cleaning staff. She was determined that everybody was going to hear what she had to say. I was naturally cynical about the woman's dubious story. She delighted in telling me the grisly details. Many of our guests actually offered her good money for a night to stay in her room to see if they too could have an encounter with Mr. Beard. But she had refused point blank. "I've paid good money to be in the haunted room," she told everyone. "I'm not about to go about handing over my privileges to all and sundry." The woman was in her late 60s with a full head of grey hair, which she scraped away from her face into a ponytail. "Of course," she told me, "I did book the room because I was hoping to see Mr. Beard's ghost. But I was highly cynical that it would actually happen. But I was hopeful, and it seems my expectancy was rewarded with results, so I'm most pleased to have had this encounter. I can now tick it off my wish list." "So you weren't scared about the possibility of seeing a ghost?" I'd asked her. "Oh, absolutely not," she told me. "Anyway, I did hear this noise," she told me, "a shuffling noise. I saw this man with a limp on his right leg, staggering forward with his walking stick. He was wearing a black bandana on his head, a scarlet dressing gown around his body, walking across the floor to the bathroom. The figure was so real I actually thought someone had accidentally turned in for the night into the wrong bedroom suite. It didn't occur to me that this was a ghost. I was under the impression ghosts are translucent, whereas this man looked solid, just like you or me. I said, "Excuse me, sir." He turned around to look at me, but his sockets were empty. His face had a very long, straggly black beard. Then he just disappeared before my eyes, as if I'd just switched off a light. I didn't know what to make of the woman's story, but I did know that Mr. Beard had a scarlet dressing gown and wore a black bandana. He also had a limp to his right leg, caused by an accident when riding his Harley-Davidson. How could she have known all this? Needless to say, she never saw him again after that. But after her encounter, word got around like wildfire. People called us to book the haunted room, room number 105. A room which many have claimed to feel as if they're being watched, have felt cold spots, heard movement, seen light orbs and heard a gunshot going off. So contrary to Mr. Beard's suicide being bad for business,
The reverse was almost certainly true. This was a haunted room for the rich and famous. The next bizarre thing that happened in the lodge was that Mrs. Madam told me that 2 men were shooting in the woods, and at 12 o'clock midday they would agree to stop shooting so that I could deliver them sandwiches and cold drinks, but I was asked to wear a bright orange vest over my jeans and sweatshirt. I went to the kitchen to gather the picnic basket. As I made my approach to the woodgrove, it suddenly occurred to me that I hadn't been told where the men were hunting. They had scouted the woodgrove the previous day, where the vast grove sprawled out for many miles all over the property, so in effect they could pretty much be anywhere. I seem to recall that many of the hunters chose to hunt on the right-hand side of the woodgrove, opposite the large meadows where the horses grazed. In truth, I was being lazy, thinking it was too much trouble to go back and get the men's coordinates, which was what I should have really done. I mean, what was I thinking? Because in truth the men could literally be hunting anywhere on the property, but I was sure I could easily locate them. I mean, how naive was I? As I ambled past the horse meadow, I stopped to caress a couple of black and bay horses, whom adored being fussed over. I made my way to the right-hand side of the woodgrove. The one thing about staying in this part of the world was that I couldn't fail to notice how magnificent everything was. Indeed, this was true, as from the moment I woke up in the mornings and pulled back the curtains to admire the countryside, I would be in awe of the viridescent green of the vegetation, the fields of sagebrush, the prickly pears, the wheatgrass, the blue gamma, and the cobalt blue colour of the sky. The countryside in this part of Colorado blows your mind. It's idyllic and mesmerisingly beautiful. The woodgroves of the lodge consist of a plethora of different tree species, from bristlecone pines, blue spruces, Douglas firs, logpole pines, quaking aspens, cottonwoods, mountain junipers, and white firs. My all-time favourite are the quaking aspen trees. I adore the way the trees quake. I also love the mountain juniper, as these trees are considered to be sacred by the indigenous people. I walked through the shaded expanse, carrying a picnic basket in my hands, prepared by the chef, into the woodgrove where there were hiking trails, occasional open clearings and rocky outcrops. The woodgrove itself was superbly shaded. The tall trees gathered together in congenial clusters, penciling up into the skies like tall, vertical, slender giants. I walked down the paths, delighting in the bird song that was very pronounced, but I never detected any of the birds, as they were possibly nesting in the highest branches of the trees. As I walked into the woodgrove, I saw pink ribbons attached to some trees. They looked brand new, so I followed them, assuming that they would lead me to the 2 hunters. All of a sudden it was as if the bird song had just dissipated. Everything became very quiet. It was an airy, creepy feeling that did leave me feeling ever so slightly discomposed and uneasy. But I told myself that the reason it was so quiet was because the 2 hunters were hiding in the shadows. The animals they were stealthily stalking had figured it out, discerning their presence, for the indigenous wildlife are exceedingly astute. They can pick up human odour, noises, or even movements very fast. If they know you're around, let's just say they will abandon the location where you have procured your hunting stand. Invariably you will walk away disappointed, thinking that no deer came your way, but that was possibly because they picked up your presence a long time ago. I had heard the 2 hunters today were not that experienced, so in my humble opinion it was rather likely that they had scared everything off unwittingly. I was walking when I suddenly became uneasy, as I thought that something was staring at me. You know when someone is looking at you, it's a feeling you can't dismiss. You know you're not imagining it. But as I glanced around the woodgrove, I could see nothing there. But why was I so certain that something was scrutinising me? Then I saw a shadowy movement and a human-like silhouette skulking through the trees. I thought it must be one of the hunters, so I confidently dashed through the trees. "Excuse me, sir," I was saying. "I've got your picnic lunch you ordered." I was lifting up my basket towards the figure, and as my eyes adjusted to the light, I realised standing only yards away from me was not a man, but a Bigfoot. For a moment I was so stunned I just froze on the spot. You would think I would have dropped my basket and run for the hills, screaming at the top of my lungs, but this is not what happened to me. I was to learn that it takes the human body time to adjust to shock. It's like for a moment you're jolted out of your reality to face a scene before your eyes that does not align with what you consider real. Much like hypothetically if you were going out into your backyard and you saw a spaceship standing there and green men entering the strange craft. The first thing that happens to you is you doubt what you're seeing. This can't be real, you say to yourself. It takes you a long while to accept that it actually is real. That's what happened to me. The next thing that happens is you are so intrigued by what you're perceiving that an inquisitive curiosity overrides your fear. I mean, in truth, this creature was the most intimidating, awesome specimen I've ever seen. But I was not filled with fear at that very moment, but complete astonishment that a creature like this could actually exist in North America. I think my eyes were round, my mouth wide with astonishment, as I surveyed this extraordinary creature. I would say he was about 8 foot tall, between 600 to 700 pounds, and over 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. He was covered with a reddish-brown hair, the colour of orangutan. It was long and flowing. The creature was studying me through his deep-set dark brown eyes. I realised I was still holding the picnic basket up towards him as if I was giving it to him. He thought I was, because he reached out to take it from me with a curious bemused expression on his face, but he did look pleased. I knew that the basket contained cold lobster salad, stuffed avocados filled with prawns and caviar, cashew and lentil burgers, Mediterranean rice salad, chocolate brownies, apple juice and cold beers. The creature took the basket from me. He grunted approvingly, nodding his head up and down in a gesture of thanks. And then I watched him gliding away. He disappeared quickly into the undergrowth and was gone. I gasped. I stood there for a while, hardly able to believe what I was seeing. I turned around and walked away, minus my picnic basket, knowing I was going to have to tell the chef to make another basket. The next thing I knew was that the creature ran back to me, tapping me on my back. I turned around, bewildered to see the creature again. He placed a river stone in my hands, nodded again, and glided away. I guess he must have been very pleased with the picnic basket. I studied the river stone curiously. It was warm to the touch, having been held in the creature's hand. It was also quite pretty. I asked the chef to make up another picnic basket. He seemed perturbed, but he did so anyway, without asking me any awkward questions. He was used to the strange requests and demands from our guests. I found the coordinates for the hunters and was able to bring them their delayed lunch. Let's just say they weren't too enamoured by the delay. I confided in Mrs. Madam that I had encountered a Bigfoot. "You encountered a Bigfoot in the woods?" she asked me. "Yes, I did," I told her. Mrs. Madam tried to digest this astounding revelation, but I knew she believed me. "Don't breathe a word about this to anyone." I never did, although I will tell you, the picnic basket was indeed delivered to our front door, containing a few more river stones, so I guess the creature thought the picnic was exceptionally good. He wasn't wrong about that. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners.
"Hurry up, Whiskey. We need to get going now,"
I told my Yorkshire Terrier. I was standing on the cul-de-sac at the end of our road, where there was a precipitous embankment about 8 feet high. Then when you got to the top of this hill, there was a rocky clearing covered with wild turf, a few rambunctious weeds, and the occasional cluster of wild flowers. But about 200 feet from the clearing was a fabulous wood grove, comprised of oaks, red maples, service berries, and crab-apple trees. If you walked around the edge of this sylvan, there was another long, narrow clearing that hugged the outer perimeters of the wood grove, which is sizable enough for a car or a tractor to drive through, for it's a long, narrow clearing, and it led directly to a large silvery lake, surrounded by the most exquisite weeping willows I've ever seen in my entire life. This glorious lake is owned and managed by a local farmer, and heavily stocked with a thriving fish population. If you go fishing there, you're unlikely to return empty-handed. The congenial farmer is a much-loved member of the community, who has generously allowed many of the locals in our neighbourhood to fish at that lake, to help keep the thriving fish population under control there, although there are some natural predators like herons and gulls that congregate in the area regularly and help in this regard as well. So it's a wonderful spot to observe waterfowl and interesting bird life. I've caught some large white bass there from time to time. I know some bald eagles have been seen soaring the skies in the area. In truth, the woodgrove and the hiking trails there are all owned by the same farmer. It's a fabulous haven for all kinds of indigenous wildlife. Suffice to say, this is an extension of his land that is surplus to requirements, so to speak, so everyone in our neighbourhood was always encouraged to go walking there, and invariably we did. Many of the folk here would climb the steep embankment with their dogs and walk through the clearing, and then take their dogs on many of the steep hiking trails that are always well maintained. The great thing about owning a Yorkshire Terrier is, let's just say, if you're a busy bee with 101 things that need to be done, you can just take your Yorkshire Terrier around the block and he'll be as happy as a pig in muck. So they are great for people who haven't got much time on their hands, or lazy buggers who would rather sit around the television drinking cola and stuffing their faces with pizza. I'm glad to say that I am neither one of the above. Needless to say, I knew I needed to get back home quickly, based on the state of the clouds. I've always found in the bluegrass state that the unheralded rain can come so fortuitously. 1 minute the impetuous sky is perfectly blue, but then it abruptly begins to turn grey. And then, as if a dimmer switch has been accessed at the mains, everything becomes ominously dark and inauspicious. Before you know it, you hear the distinctive, portentous, booming, rumbling sounds of the very aggrieved, baleful thunder in the distance, warning you of his impending wrath. A storm is brewing. Hey presto, you suddenly find yourself being sprinkled with raindrops. At first they're faint, rather slight and random, but you know they will change, as they always do. This is the serendipitous warning sign that you need to get home as quickly as possible, or let's just say, if you don't, the heavens will involuntarily open. The only way you will return home is looking like a half-drowned kitten, for when it rains hard here in the bluegrass state, it definitely pours, and I mean it literally comes down in sheets or buckets. It buckets down so hard, it's not the kind of rain for the faint-hearted, timid or cowering by nature. Hurry up, Whiskey, I was saying to my tenacious Yorkshire Terrier, who really believes he's bigger than Mr. Piers' Great Dane, and far more dangerous than the Thompsons' 2 Rottweilers, both close neighbours of ours, who live on either side of us. Indeed, my little spirited Yorkshire Terrier is so bold, bumptious and assertive that he quite literally makes a beeline for all the big dogs. As far as Whiskey is concerned, the bigger the dog, the better. Most of these full-blooded big dogs are so taken aback, seemingly bemused by Whiskey's dogmatic and perilous assertiveness, that instead of seeing my little dog as a tiny bedraggled rat, he comes across intimidating because of his brazen, audacious confidence. I've known big dogs to be terribly afraid of Whiskey. He's quite a dominant, bossy little rascal. We need to get back, boy. A storm is brewing. We need to hurry. It would seem my warning words were of little significance to Whiskey, whose little nose had discerned an intriguing, curious smell in the turf. He wanted to enjoy it. All the different bouquets were very intriguing to him. Listen, Whiskey, we need to go, I said, tugging the lead hard. I glanced up at the sky dubiously. It had become dark and gloomy. Then it happened. The distant rumble of thunder rippled across the ether like a pounding drum. We need to get back, I urged my dog. Finally Whiskey looked up at me through his dark, sparkling brown eyes, trotting obediently up the road, resigning himself to the fact that the man whom he believed he owned and not the other way round was cowering at the prospect of rain. I'm quite sure in our relationship Whiskey believed that he was the big boy and I was the little one. Whiskey walked ahead of me, with me trailing behind him, holding his blue lead in my hand. The street where I live is very pretty, with lots and lots of yard space in front of the houses, beyond the red brick pavements. Most of the individualistic houses have been well maintained, with beautiful yards that are manicured and mown. The street is lined on either side with cherry blossom trees that burst into bloom during spring. But at that time of the year, the street looks sensational. But it's a pity it's so fleeting, as those blossoms don't last terribly long. I'm glad that the houses where we live aren't on top of each other. They're scattered apart significantly, so that every homeowner has an adequate amount of space. I'm very big on enjoying my yard space. I'm a keen gardener that thoroughly enjoys growing roses and vegetables. We live in an attractive old 50s home that was recently modernised. It has symmetrical exteriors, white walls and a red terracotta roof, giving it a doll's house appearance that I find rather endearing. It oozes charm and character. These days houses with character are beginning to cost an awful lot. A Queen Anne house will be snapped up faster than you can say Jack Robinson. People are really into historic houses these days. My wife simply can't comprehend my incessant need to be in the yard, But I love it out there. I enjoy the feel of the sand and the fresh air blowing against my face. By all accounts, Whiskey was supposed to be my wife's dog, but he gravitated towards me, promptly deciding that I was the one that he wanted to hang around with. I just have one thing to say about that. There is no accounting for good taste. The little guy knows I'm infinitely more interesting than the wife. At first I thought I'd feel rather effeminate walking around with a cute little Yorkshire Terrier on a leash, that so many women might tuck away in their purses, dress up in cute little outfits, and adorn with glitzy diamante collars. But not Whiskey. I think he'd be appalled to wear an outfit or to be stuck in a purse. He's a man's dog through and through. He has the heart of a lion and is fearless and brave, and can stand up to any dogs 3 times his size. So I no longer feel self-conscious about walking the tiny little mite around our neighbourhood, as I did in the early days. As I was walking up our road, I had no idea that today something quite extraordinary was going to happen, that would ultimately lead to a series of peculiar events, that like a set of dominoes would ultimately all come crashing down, one after another. My house is the second house situated on the crown of our street, where there's another street on the pinnacle of our road, running horizontally across our street in a long straight line. It's another residential street, not unlike our own, full of residential spaced-out properties, all individual and different in our neighbourhood. An eclectic, varied mix, with Queen Anne, Victorian, 50s, 80s, craftsman, ranch style, and modern contemporary homes. I like the latter a whole lot less, as some of them look angular and officey. Not my cup of tea, I hasten to add, but then, as my wife is always inclined to say, each to his own. I could feel a few drops of rain cascading down my face, so I began to increase my pace steadily, before I got caught up in the deluge. Then it happened. I saw this young boy of about 8 years old, riding his bicycle across the road. I imagine he was eager to get back home, due to the scent of rain on the wind. The next thing I knew was that a truck came racing down that road so fast, driving right through the bicycle, not stopping to draw breath, but leaving behind a treacherous pugnacity, or scene of carnage if you like. The young boy's bicycle went flying into the air. So did the boy. Thank God he was wearing a helmet, as he came colliding down onto the asphalt road with a mighty thunderous crash. It was as if time stood still. Everything happened in slow motion, like a silent movie. The anonymous driver in the truck drove away so fast. The boy and his bicycle lay silently in the middle of the road, unflinching and unmoving. The bicycle was now a gnarled wreck. I ran up towards the young boy, my heart thundering in my chest at 100 miles an hour. I don't mind admitting that I was petrified of what I would encounter. I was almost positive that the boy would be dead. I'm glad to say I found that he still had a pulse, but it was a very slow pulse. It didn't look good. The boy was clearly unconscious. I vigorously pulled my cell phone out of the back pocket of my white cargo pants and dialed 911, tapping away vigorously on my cell phone, almost as if my life depended on it. "Help!" I cried down the phone, finding it difficult to articulate my words, as there was a huge lump sticking in the back of my throat. Please come at once. It looks like a young 8-year-old boy, could be younger, could be older, has been knocked over by a truck. It was a hit and run, an SUV. The police arrived on the scene in what seemed like seconds. How they got there so fast was hard to fathom. Our road was now teeming with a plethora of activity that spelt out into the ether the words accident. There was police vehicles everywhere, with blue lights flashing. An ambulance flashing with red lights had soon arrived on the scene. The EMTs were assessing the damage, hovering over the young boy anxiously, administering first aid to him. All of a sudden, people came dashing out of their houses, rather like bees being smoked out of their hives, some still wearing their pyjamas, others swimming costumes, gym gear, and, of course, suits and outfits. People were gathering around the scene in congenial, flustered-looking groups, talking together in low, troubled voices. One young woman let out a loud, ear-piercing scream that was so shrill it sent shivers of dread down my spine, causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand up on edge, rather like the prickles on a hedgehog. "That's my baby! That's my baby!" she screamed. Her voice was so gripped with terror. "Jason! Jason! Jason!" she said, hovering over the boy like a frantic bee over a can of sugary cola. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked the EMT. "He's not going to die, is he? Please, God, don't let him die." The woman became hysterical, and the EMT was trying to calm her down. "Listen, ma'am, we're taking your son to the hospital right now. We need you to be calm for his sake. You can come with us and hold his hand if you like. Your son has been badly hit. He's unconscious." "But is he going to die? Is my son going to die? Someone answer me. Why won't anyone answer me?" "Calm down, madam. You need to be strong for your son's sake. If you're upset, he will pick it up, even if he's unconscious," said one of the EMTs, leading the woman into the ambulance. "It's early days. The doctors will evaluate your son when we get to the hospital. The main thing is he's alive, and that's very good news. These days they can work miracles. The secret is to be positive and to pray. Now let's get moving, shall we?" The woman looked rather familiar to me. She was absolutely distraught. My heart went out to her as she climbed into the ambulance, the door closing behind her, the vehicle whizzing away down the long ribbon of asphalt, red lights flashing and sirens blazing until it had gone. One of the policemen was calling my name. "Can I speak to Hank Barry?" "That's me," I said, raising my hand, walking towards the officer with whiskey still on the lead. Many of the locals were engaged in garrulous chatter. "Who runs over an 8-year-old boy, I ask you, and just scarpers and beats a hasty retreat from the scene like that? Who runs over an 8-year-old boy and just scarpers and beats a hasty retreat from the scene like that? What is the world coming to? What about human decency and integrity?" was some of the chatter that I picked up on the wind. Everyone was naturally unhinged about an accident of an 8-year-old boy left for dead in the middle of the road. Who could do such a despicable thing? The police officer was a man in his early 30s. I could see he was terribly discomposed. "I have a child the very same age," he told me, shaking his head furiously in an aggrieved, disgruntled manner. "My son regularly cycles on his bike. It breaks my heart to see an accident like this," he said, shuddering. "It could so easily have been my son. We've got to get this villain, whoever he is. I won't rest until he's safely behind bars," he said, placing his pen in his mouth and nibbling the end. "I hope to God it wasn't any kids joyriding. Could you tell me, Mr. Barry, what it was you saw? You were saying you witnessed the account, so I would very much appreciate it if you will start from the very beginning. Don't leave any details out. It's in the details we tend to solve our crimes. People so often overlook the small stuff, but it's the small stuff that leads us directly to the perpetrator. Well, I was walking my little dog here. His name's Whiskey. I knew it was going to rain, but it appears to have abated for some reason. I was hurriedly making tracks home. I happened to glance up my street. I saw a young boy cycling vigorously across the road above ours. The next thing I knew, this truck was driving way too fast, far too fast to be able to stop in time. So he went right through the boy, causing a significant impact to the front bumper of the car. Oh, the boy, his bicycle and the boy went flying in the air, and he came crashing down to the ground with such a force, rather like a fly thumping against a glass window pane. Usually when that happens, the fly is completely pulverized. At that graphic reference, the policeman wrinkled up his nose in disgust. I don't think my analogy impressed him greatly. "I thought the poor boy must be dead. If he did survive, it will be thanks to the fact that he was wearing a helmet. All I knew was the SUV went riding right through him and never stopped. So you're saying the truck did not stop?" "No, it didn't stop. It slowed down for a second or so as it veered around the scene of carnage. Then it sped up and drove fast away. I mean, it speeded up very fast. I know the driver knew exactly what he'd done. That was a forceful hit. I'm certain the front of his truck must be very mangled. It looked all concaved and buckled at a glance. You could definitely hear the sound of pulverizing metal and the heavy thumps. But of course it all happened very fast." "But he still drove away," said the police officer, a frown developing on his face. "Bloody bastard! If I could throttle him myself, I would. But I have to leave that to the law. Let me tell you, he ain't going to get away with this. We will catch him.
And as you were saying, his bonnet has been badly damaged, and that is our first very good clue. He still drove away, I affirmed. It did happen fast, although everything was in slow motion. What kind of truck was it, sir? What colour? Do you remember? I flushed with embarrassment. I realised I had no recall of the truck, not what kind of car apart from being an SUV, as my focus had been completely on the boy on the bicycle. I think it was dark. It was definitely an SUV, but in truth I can't remember what kind it was. It was very badly damaged in the front. I did see that, because it was just so surreal. All I could think about was the boy. Was he all right? Was he dead? I never gave the driver a moment's thought, until of course he had absconded from the scene, and by then it was too late. The policeman sighed. Don't beat yourself up about it, sir. It's an accident. People often forget details like that. But if you do remember anything, Mr. Barry, it doesn't matter how seemingly small or insignificant it may be. I urge you to give me a call at once. As you can imagine, when I returned home, my wife had already heard about the startling accident. You won't believe what happened at the top of our road. Judy's son Oliver was knocked over by a hit and run. I gather he's unconscious and is in hospital. They don't know if he's going to be all right. That was Judy's son, I gasped. I knew Judy and her husband Marco very well, through my wife. Why had I not recognised her at the scene of the accident? God only knows. Perhaps trauma obscures your recognition. What's wrong? My wife asked me, looking perturbed. You're as white as a sheet. Then she glanced down to see that I was still holding Whiskey's leash, and realised I'd come back from a walk. I think my bewildered, almost glazed over, rather vacuous expression rather illuminated the fact to my wife that somehow I had seen the accident. My wife cupped her hand around her mouth. Oh, my God! You saw the accident, didn't you? I nodded. I saw everything. I've spoken to the police, but unfortunately my hazy memories are so vague about the important details. I'm cursing myself for not paying greater attention. Don't blame yourself, sweetheart, said my wife effusively, throwing her arms around me, stroking my chin affectionately. Now don't you go beating yourself up about this. You had a nasty, terrible shock. When you go through trauma, you can't be prevailed upon to memorise all the details from such a graphically haunting, deplorable scene. Not to worry. The police know exactly what they're doing. I'm sure they'll catch the scoundrel, the cold-blooded thug, whoever he is. I hope they lock him up and throw away the key, she snapped. It might not be a he, I suggested. No way, she insisted. Never a woman. You think a woman would run over a young boy and fail to stop for him? Most women are mothers and daughters. They would instinctively run over to help a child in trouble. The maternal instinct is powerful. Besides, women are good at bumper bashing. But the speeding thing? No, that's a man. Got to be a man. Of course women are capable of doing despicable things, just as much as men are. We don't have the monopoly on crime, I'll have you know. Well, whoever is responsible, said my wife, ignoring my suggestion that the perpetrator could be female, I hope they get him. Or her, I interceded. I mean, think about it. It's got to be someone local, in this area. We don't get outsiders, so it's got to be local, someone we possibly know. And there can't be many people driving around with a mangled bonnet at the moment. My wife's words hit me like a brick to the head. Of course, she was absolutely right. The person who left Judy's son for dead was more than likely someone we knew, or knew of by association, as most people in our community were on first-name terms with each other. The people driving around our area were usually locals, not someone from out of state. As you can imagine, in every coffee shop, bistro, diner, school classroom and cocktail lounge, the gossip among the locals was rife. It was about one thing. Who had run over Judy's son? Who had been speeding in their truck, leaving him for dead? People looked at each other with an air of suspicion as they pondered. Was it you? Was it you? It was awful to know that among the local community, one person was sitting on a dark, insidious secret that was festering away in their heart. It was clear that people were studying each other's bumpers in parking lots, and the guilty party, whoever she or he was, must be definitely running scared by now. From what I could discern, no one had a buckled bonnet, and the car mechanics in the area had not reported any trucks being brought in for repairs. Whoever the perpetrator was, they were one step ahead of the game, as the police were beginning to draw blanks. My wife was very close to Judy. She was more my wife's friend than mine. What I'd learnt from my wife was that Judy's son was unconscious and had undergone multiple operations for various fractures, but was in a stable condition, but still on life support. Judy had sobbed to my wife on the phone. "My son's just attached to all these dreadful machines. I don't know what to do. The surgeon tells me it's all a waiting game to see if my son will respond. But they do say that children at his age have resilient bodies. They can often bounce back. He says they can make a full recovery sometimes." "Well, there you are," said my wife. "It sounds like there is a rainbow on the horizon. All we have to do is pray. Everything's going to be fine, I promise you." When I walked Little Whiskey the next day on the side of the road, I noticed where the grisly accident had occurred were flowers, big teddy bears and all kinds of mascots strewn across the red brick pavement like a memorial, almost as if Judy's son was dead, even though he was fighting for his life. I went to read some of the mascots. They were so sweet and so encouraging, saying things like, "Wishing you well, young man. May God bless you. Wishing you a swift recovery." A week passed and my wife and I were in the living room watching an insipid, bland movie on television. The kind of cheap crap that uses erotic scenes in order to get views, because the movie itself is absolutely horrendous, badly made, and put simply just drivel. My wife got up and exclaimed, "I'm tired, sweetheart. I'm going to bed. I'm afraid the movie's not holding my attention. All these explicit scenes are doing my head in. It's like the movie producers have no taste anymore. Nothing is sacred these days." "It's not that they have no taste, sweetheart," I told her. "It's they're damn lazy. Far too lazy to make a decent story to hold our attention. So they use the sneakiest, most duplicitous trick in the book to increase their viewership. Erotica. God only knows why it actually works." She sighed. "Well, I'm going to bed. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted." "All right, I'm coming soon," I said. I continued to watch a bit of the movie while drinking a beer and eating a handful of peanuts. But unfortunately, much like my wife, I must have been very uninspired, as I dozed off to sleep. I awoke a long while later with Whiskey lying on the couch next to me, fast asleep. The whole house was steeped in darkness, apart from the flashing lights of the moving picture on my flat-screen television. I glanced up briefly at the clock above the wooden mantel of our marble fireplace. I realised it was 12 at night. It was getting late. I was just about to go to bed when I suddenly remembered I had to put the trash out. I could do it extra early in the morning, I thought, but I knew I was likely to oversleep. That wasn't a viable solution. I'd better do it now. "Oh," I groaned like a belligerent teenager. It was the last thing I felt like doing. I hated putting out the rubbish. My eyelids were beginning to close. I was feeling very droopy, rather like a flower in need of watering. I was in need of sleep. I proceeded to gather the black bin bag from my kitchen bin. It was almost bursting at the seams, it was so full. I tied a knot at the tip of the liner. I proceeded to walk out to the yard carrying the black bag in my hands. I tossed the black bag onto the heap of other black liners into the main bin, which I wheeled to the front yard close to the asphalt road, ready for the binmen to collect in the following morning. I stopped dead in my tracks, as driving down our road in the middle of the night was a dark SUV. It didn't have its lights on, which was incredibly suspicious, but I could see the bonnet was completely concave, buckled in and very scratched. It looked like the car that had knocked over the 8-year-old boy who was on life support in intensive care. I couldn't see the driver. The windows were dark, but I don't believe the driver had observed me. I knew our road was a cul-de-sac, but the truck never turned around to drive back up our road. Something was exceedingly fishy. Now the hackles on my neck were standing on edge. I knew I had to find answers. I was almost certain the car I'd seen driving very slowly down our street this late at night, with its car lights switched off, was indeed the car the police were searching for. But where had it gone on a one-way street? Was someone living in our road guilty of this heinous crime, I wondered? It was conceivable. I knew that Judy had been on the radio recently, being interviewed by a local radio DJ. I could see the programme flashing back in my mind. "Judy, what would you like to say to the person that has run over your son?" His voice had boomed over the radio. I'd like him to man up and to take responsibility, not to be such a coward. Admit to the police what you've done. Come forward now. My little boy is lying in intensive care, fighting for his life because of you. Whoever you are, you left an 8-year-old boy to die in the middle of a road. You should be ashamed of yourself. You should have the guts to come forward. What you have done, you have ruined my life. Well, there are no words, and as a mother, I don't know how to comprehend such behaviour. I don't understand how you sleep at night. I'm sure he's not sleeping at night, said the radio host. Indeed, I think that the case will haunt him forever, whoever he is. And whoever you are, I do advise you to do the decent thing. Own up to what you've done. Take responsibility. Anyone out there, if you see anyone behaving suspiciously, or notice someone's truck with an unexplainable indentation in the bonnet caused from some kind of collision, you know what you need to do. Give the police a call at once. They need to be able to literally say that that person was not responsible, but at least you will know you reported them to the police. I decided that time was of the essence, so I gathered my head torch, put on another sweater over my red polo shirt, and then dashed out of the house, not quite sure what I would find, or how to go about looking for the mysterious truck, but I sensed deep down in my gut that I was about to solve this mystery. Most people in this part of the world retired to bed early, rose early in the morning. That was how we tended to live around here. It was our way of life. I walked down our street. The street lights, along with the almost full moon, covered the fauna and flora in an ethereal, shimmering silvery light, while the bright stars of the velvety black night seemed to serenade the moon in their showy, twinkling display. It was a beautiful, very pleasing night. It was pleasant to walk down the street like this, but all the houses were steeped in darkness, apart from the occasional outside light, some with motion-activated receptors. There was a still breeze blowing that caused the trees in our street to shake their boughs, but I found the cool wind that kissed my face to be bracing and invigorating. I wanted to see if I could see any sign of activity, but all was silent, with of course the exception of the nightly crickets and frogs singing their tuneful chorus, the odd sound of an owl hooting, along with the distant wail of a coyote. Finally I was at the end of the road, on the curl of the cul-de-sac, facing the embankment, the clearing, and the woodgrove. Then I gasped. I realised that the truck I had seen had driven itself up the embankment, for I could see the deep telltale tyre marks entrenched in the turf, as the ground was very moist after a plethora of torrential rain recently. Maybe the perpetrator was intending to set the car alight with petrol in an obscure place on the narrow clearing at the edge of the woodgrove opposite the lake. Whoever they were, they could still be around. I realised now that I needed to be very quiet and inconspicuous to make absolutely certain I was not seen by the stranger. I switched off my headlight and dashed down the narrow clearing, my senses alerted to any signs of movement. I could see the tyre tracks went around the side of the woodgrove towards the large lake. That was another thought that dawned on me. Maybe the perpetrator had allowed the truck to sink to the bottom of the lake. That would be an excellent place to hide a vehicle that was wanted by the police. I hurriedly followed the tyre tracks. Sure enough, they led directly to the lake. But the perpetrator clearly had not thought to remove the track marks. That would be something I would do if I was trying to cover my tracks or conceal a duplicitous crime. Otherwise, it's so easy to get caught. Whoever they were, they had never read a Sherlock Holmes mystery before, for if they had, they may have been a wee bit more assertive and removed those tracks. I trudged towards the lake. The ground was muddy. I almost lost my balance a couple of times. I remained very quiet in case the person that had disposed of the truck was still loitering around. I was studying the lake. I noticed that the still water was rippling with high frisky waves, almost as if someone had disturbed the water by swimming. That was when I could see an obscure head bobbing up and down the surface of the water, and then this massive being was pulling something from the murky depths out of the water onto the river bank. I could hardly believe it. Who had the strength to do that?
It was the dark SUV that had been recently swallowed by the water. Now this huge thing was being brought out from its watery grave, much like a police recovery project. I cautiously moved closer, hardly being able to fathom what my eyes were perceiving, for the silhouette of what appeared to be a humongous man-like figure was hauling out the SUV with two powerful arms, without much difficulty at all, I might add. I stealthily crept towards a large weeping willow, where I hid behind the curvaceous trunk. It was close to the water's edge. The shafts of soft moonlight danced and dappled across the face of the strange humanoid. Imagine my astonishment to realize the creature that pulled the SUV out of the lake was a Bigfoot. Surely not, I thought. For a moment I stared at the Bigfoot with an incredulous look on my face, for until this moment I had considered such a creature to be legendary. I had been one of those cynical, sceptical types that bases everything on evidence and fact. But now I was seeing the Bigfoot larger than life with my very own eyes. I was in no doubt that this creature was a Bigfoot, although this was much more human a creature than some of the pictures I'd been privy to seeing on YouTube clips. Even the Patterson footage depicts a creature much more ape-like with his influences compared to the one I was beholding, which has led me to conclude that there might be different species of the creatures. I would go as far as to say that this creature was human, but he had longer arms than we do, a bigger arch-shaped head, and was covered in long flowing hair. I'm not sure of the exact colour of the hair, but it looked to me to be a dark colour, possibly with a hint of auburn, but I cannot affirm that fact with certainty. But I will say this, the creature was Herculean in size, with an elephantine muscle mass. Let's just say he would make the world's strongest man green at the gills and squirm with envy, like an octopus at the end of a fisherman's spear. Because sorry, mate, you could not compete with Mr. Bigfoot. Well, not the one I saw, anyway. The one I saw was about 8 foot, and about 800 to 900 pounds. I could hear him whistling to himself as he examined the wet car, like a happy car mechanic. He opened the driver's side door, yanking it off so hard that the door came off its hinges. Then he climbed inside and played in the SUV for a long time. He sat at the steering wheel like a kid, as if pretending to drive. Then he pulled out the back seat of the SUV with one large tug with his powerful hand, and placed it on the riverbank. And then he dragged the rest of the trunk to the edge of the lake and pushed it back into the water, along with the detached driver's door. And then it began to sink to the bottom of the lake. The Bigfoot walked off with the back seat under his overlong arm, much like a yoga mat, and glided away. I guess he had discerned that the seat would be very useful to him. I suppose it could, in a way. I watched the way he moved. He looked like he was floating on air. As I was turning around to go back to the house, I heard someone on the path making a very distinctive thrashing sound. Then I saw a figure, a silhouette of a human with a trowel, using the back of a spade to eliminate the tyre tracks by smoothing them over like you do with cement to create a flat, seamless finish. It would seem that whomever they weren't as naive as I thought they were. Imagine my surprise when I saw that the person with the trowel trying to eliminate the evidence by smoothing down the track marks was no other than Dawn Hepburn. She was the vicar's wife. This was a woman who was supposed to be the quintessential pillar of the community. She was involved with so many charities for Save the Children, but she hadn't even got out of her SUV to save a young 8-year-old boy. The mind boggles. I could feel the bile rising up in the back of my throat, the anger surging through my body. The woman was a hypocrite. There was nothing I loathed more than the so-called Pharisees of society, that to the outside world did everything by the holy book, but behind closed doors they were treacherously deceitful. "Hello, Dawn. What are you doing here in the middle of the night with your spade?" Dawn flushed. She looked up at me, a picture of horror, her face going a crimson red. "Well, I could ask you the very same thing, Hank," she said, her voice sounding as if she was out of breath. I detected there were beads of perspiration dripping down her forehead, like tears. I noticed she was wearing jeans and what appeared to be her husband's plaid shirt. "Well, I'm out for a walk. Touch of insomnia, I guess. But why are you out here?" "Would you believe it?" she said. "I got this fabulous idea to plant daffodil bulbs on the embankment in spring so that it would look very becoming for all the locals when they come out for their walks." "So you decided to do this at, let's see, 2 o'clock in the morning?" Dawn began to laugh rather awkwardly, but her guileful mind was working rather quickly. Well, I also suffer from insomnia as it happens, so I thought, why don't I come down to the embankment and plant these lovely daffodil bulbs so the embankment will be bursting with yellow flowers next spring, and everybody will be just so amazed by the magic, and I won't tell anybody that it's me that's behind it all.
Cut the bull, Dawn. Do you think I believe your baloney? Whose car is that you're driving now? I asked, pointing to the car parked in the curl of the cul-de-sac.
That's my daughter's car. I'm just borrowing it.
I see, Dawn. And where is your dark SUV? Come to think of it, you haven't been driving it recently. I suppose it might have something to do with a very mangled bonnet, due to the fact, Dawn, that over a week ago you drove over an 8-year-old boy on a bicycle, left him for dead. Does the pastor know about this, or is this your devious little treacherous secret that you do not have the guts to confess to what you have done?
How do you know it was me?
Because, Dawn, I saw your SUV running over the little boy. Then tonight, when it was dark, you drove down our street with your lights turned off, so that you could drive your SUV into the lake. You aren't planting daffodils here on the embankment for spring, are you, Dawn? Your intentions are deviously cunning. You're trying to cover up your ambiguous crime.
Dawn lifted up her large spade. She began to lash out at me with it, but I grabbed it from her. She was a small woman.
Don't even think about it, Dawn. You don't stand a chance against me. It's not a good idea.
Please, Hank, you've got to believe me. This whole thing, it was a dreadful accident. I didn't mean to harm the boy.
So it was an accident to go speeding down a residential road so fast that you didn't have any time to stop? Didn't you know that when you drive in a residential area when there are dogs, kids and bicycles around, you're supposed to drive slowly? But you, Dawn, you drove like a maniac.
I know, said Dawn, her eyes filling with tears. Me and my husband, well, we've been at each other's throats recently. We can't seem to see eye to eye about anything. I guess when I was driving, my mind was on other things.
That's no excuse, Dawn.
Well, wouldn't your mind be on other things, said Dawn. If you must know, I had to confront my husband with evidence. He'd been having an affair. My husband, the man who claims to be a devoted man of God, who lectures people in sermons about infidelity and lust. What does he do? He cheats on me. My face paled significantly. This is not what I wanted to hear. This was not good news. People in the local community really looked up to the pastor and his wife as representative of the church. And a pastor engaging in an adulterous affair would be devastating to the community and certainly knock their confidence and faith in the church.
Is this true?
It is true. And worse still, that little boy lying in a hospital bed is the son of the very woman cheating with my husband.
You mean Judy is the one having an affair with your husband?
The woman nodded.
Oh, my God! You didn't run over the boy deliberately, did you?
Of course not. I'm not a complete lunatic. The child is an innocent part. It's his mother who had the affair. Why would I intentionally lash out at an innocent child?
Oh, my God, I said. The webs we weave. This is ridiculous. What did your husband say when you confronted him about the affair?
He begged me to forgive him. He told me it meant nothing. He told me it was all over. But how can I forgive him? I'm mad as hell.
Why, Dawn, did you not tell the police about the accident? You drove off leaving a boy to die in the middle of the road, and there is no excuse for that.
I know, said Dawn, the tears pouring down her face. I guess my life was just falling apart around me, and running over the boy, it just got too much.
Look, I said to her kindly, come back with me to my home. We'll have a nice hot cup of chocolate, and tomorrow you're going to do the very right thing. You're going to go to the police and tell them what you told me. If you don't tell them, I will do it for you. Judy came and joined me in the kitchen for some hot chocolate, and then went home. And as bizarre as this may sound to you, I think she seemed heartily relieved, as living with what she had done was eating away at her, and now being forced to confess brought her a measure of peace. The next day my wife called me into the kitchen and turned on the local radio. It would seem that a woman has come forward to the police admitting to having run over the 8-year-old child that is currently fighting for his life in hospital, the report told us. In the weeks and months that went by, the local community found it exceedingly hard to get their heads around the fact that it was the pastor's wife that was the one who'd run over the 8-year-old boy. People perceived that she was the last person in the world they would believe was capable of such a senseless, irrational crime. At first the knives were out for the woman, until the community learnt of her husband's affair. That was when people felt empathetic towards Dawn. They were disgusted about what the pastor had done, especially as he represented the local church. Thankfully, Judy's son recovered from the accident and is healthy and fighting fit today. As for the pastor's wife, Dawn, she didn't get away completely with what she'd done. She did do community service for a while and received a steep fine. She is still married to her pastor husband, but they wisely moved away from our part of the world, as people here would find it very hard to listen to a pastor lecturing about infidelity when he was caught up in it as well. I'm glad to say Judy is still living with her husband, despite the affair, so she's got one hell of a forgiving husband. I still think back to the very night when I saw Bigfoot hauling out a huge SUV from the lake. I feel incredibly privileged to have encountered the magnificent beast. I have one thing to say. Thank God that I had to put out the trash that night. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I had been sagaciously and very wisely warned about Mrs. Bonnet when I started working at the local florist's. I'd learnt that she was rather tough on her staff, would not stand for anyone ever arriving late. By all accounts, I was thoroughly enjoying my job. It was the quintessential opportunity to be away from home for a change and to express my creativity. When you have young children to organise in the early mornings to get off to school, it's never easy. There are invariably always delays, as my kids could not find a missing shoe at the very last minute, or something like that usually our mischievous dog Scruffball had somehow squirreled away under the sofa, along with a plethora of other items that he always hides away. I mean, what, I ask you, does a dog want with a hairbrush, a pair of nail clippers, a ball of wool, 3 odd socks, Lego blocks, a headless Barbie, and a teddy bear? But you name it, Scruffball was always hiding everything away. Ironically, it was always the very thing you were looking for at the last minute that seamlessly had vanished off the face of the planet. On this occasion, looking for my son's shoe had consumed all our precious time I could ill afford to lose. Then there were other times when I'd taken my kids to school and my daughter Cindy informed me that she had forgotten her lunchbox at home. So I had to drive all the way back to get it for her, as I couldn't have my kids starving at school, or what kind of a mother would that make me? Now anyone who's ever had children will comprehend what I'm talking about. Every morning it's like an obstacle course to get your children ready for school. It's not just about dressing yourself and getting yourself together, but 2 rambunctious, adrenalised kids as well, that would be likely to leave their heads behind if given the chance. Of course, they never tell you when you decide to have kids of all the challenges along the way, how hard to find any time for yourself it's going to be. I had come to a place in my life that I was literally yearning and longing for adult company, as looking after both my kids and talking to them expeditiously all day about Eddie the Turtle and Ronnie the Octopus in one of their storybooks was becoming laboriously prosaic. I think if I heard my kid talk about Ronnie's wandering tentacles one more time, I would quite literally go bananas. Don't get me wrong, I'm very glad I had kids. I have no regrets on that score, but I never knew just how enervating and debilitating it would be to be watching over my children day in and day out 24/7. How listless, feeble and fatigued I would become. I remember once learning about some birds that lay their eggs in other birds' nests, so another mother of a different species is forced to look after the strange chicklet. When I was young, I thought that lazy mum should be very ashamed of herself. Now I think she's really rather astute. It makes perfect sense to divide the responsibilities when it comes to raising kids, as there's one thing every mother needs, and that's some free time to be her authentic self, along with a good, decent night's sleep. One day my best friend May and I were randomly discussing how to be more efficient mothers, where we could enjoy our kids, but at the very same time have some me time to ourselves. We both emphatically decided that Monday, Tuesdays and Wednesdays I could have that time to myself, while she would take care of my kids after picking them up from school. While on Thursday, Fridays and Saturdays she could do whatever she wanted, and I would take her kids under my charge. The arrangement had quite literally transformed our lives. We were like wary, droopy flowers that were suddenly watered and revitalized, becoming bright and colourful again, renewed in our health, energy and personal happiness. Life was 1,000 times better for the both of us, and we now had our personal space. I worked 3 times a week at the florist in town. For me, this was the release I needed from being shackled to my job as a mother. I felt as if my clipped wings had finally grown back, that I could fly all over again. My boss, Miss Bonnet, had given 2 warnings to me for being late. I somehow felt like a reprimanded, admonished school kid for being told off by the headmistress for being a very naughty girl. I wasn't surprised to learn that in her youth Miss Bonnet had been a teacher, which was why in running her florist she did so with an iron fist. She didn't pack any punches either. Lynn, the girl who worked full-time at the florist, assured me that if I was late more than 3 times, I would definitely be sacked. "I'm not joking," she warned me. "Miss Bonnet can be as tough as old boots. She doesn't take excuses kindly. I promise you she's been through staff as often as you have eaten chocolate." I ate chocolate an awful lot, so that must mean she had got through a plethora of staff. The first time I was late at the florist was when my daughter had thrown up all over her school uniform. I sent her to May's house to recover from her upset stomach, but Miss Bonnet was not sympathetic. "I can't abide people being late. I don't listen to petty excuses. You've made arrangements for someone else to take care of your kids, so why the delay?" "Well," I said, "I had to help my daughter wash up all the mess, change into new clothes. Then I dropped her off at May's house." "That's still no excuse," she said. "None at all. You have someone else looking after your daughter on Monday, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so why are you making up soppy stories? Have you never heard of delegation before? Isn't that why you've got someone helping you out?" Lynn had rolled her eyes in the back of her head as Miss Bonnet lambasted me with a real dressing down. I realised Lynn was absolutely right. I was definitely going to lose my job if I wasn't expediently prompt. If I was going to keep this job, I was going to have to be punctilious and pedantic about all my timekeeping. That was not going to be plain sailing by any manner of means, as sooner or later something would happen that would invariably delay me. I was so enjoying working at the florist. I'd met so many fabulous customers, and I was rarely relishing making up stunning, beautiful flower arrangements for all our clients, for all kinds of spectacular occasions. One morning my dog Scruffball appeared to be struggling to get sick. I discovered there was a lump in the back of her throat. I began to panic, as something was clearly stuck in her alimentary canal. I was worried that my dog's airway was being blocked. When I took her to the vet, he removed one of my son's soft little plastic lizards that had got caught up in her throat and pulled it out. It came out in one piece, a horizontal shoe-sized bright green lizard, and of course everyone cracked up laughing, while Scruffball looked terribly pleased with herself and very happy to be reunited with the green lizard. But I popped it right back into my purse. Of course, when Miss Bonnet found out why I was late, she wasn't impressed, nor even remotely amused. "You sound as if you live in a circus. You shouldn't be leaving your son's plastic lizard around for your dog to eat. I'm sorry, but this is your second warning." "One more warning, and you're out, Heather." "Miss Bonnet," I said to her, "I think you're being fallaciously unreasonable. I really do." "Well, that's your opinion, dear, and you're entitled to that. But it's not mine. I think it's sapiently judicious for my staff to arrive on time, to keep their houses in apple pie order so that plastic lizards don't get caught up in dogs' esophaguses. Why on earth do you have plastic lizards lying around your house in the first place? I don't understand. Haven't you heard of boxes for toys for your kids?" "Mrs. Bonnet, have you ever had children before?" "No, I have not, dear, and I'm very glad about that. I also have not been weighed down with a husband. I've been on my own all my life, and that works very well for me, thank you very much. You know, Miss Bonnet, if I lived alone, I'd be able to turn up for work like clockwork every day. Things happen when you raise kids. I promise you they do. Sometimes you can't help but run late, because you're not just taking care of yourself, but you're taking care of an entire family. And any woman who's been a mother, in my opinion, is a hero. It's one hell of a tough job. I always say being a mother is the hardest, most underrated and underappreciated job in the entire world. Well, you should have thought about that, dear, before you decided to raise a family, shouldn't you? You know the problem with young people today? They're all far too eager to jump into the sack, failing to consider the long-term inauspicious ramifications of their decisions. Consequently, they fall pregnant, failing abysmally to take charge when the kids arrive on the scene. If you choose to have kids, my dear, then you need to manage them properly. If you decide to keep pets, make sure you don't leave plastic reptiles lying around. It's unambiguously straightforward, not rocket science. Yes, Miss Bonnet, I said, perceiving that getting through to her would indeed be harder than training Scruffball to stop stealing our stuff and hiding it from us. Heather, said Miss Bonnet, I will remind you, this is your second warning. The next time you're late, you will be out. I cannot show staunch favouritism to one member of staff over another. Rules are rules, and they're not made to be broken. Do you understand? I knew there was no point in expostulating with the woman, so consequently I was literally hanging on a cliff edge by a thin spidery web. One wrong move, I would go plunging from the rocks to the rock pool below with a mighty crash, which meant one thing only. Invariably Miss Bonnet would sack me. I know it sounds incredulous, but I did get the distinct impression that Miss Bonnet thoroughly enjoyed being officiously bossy and subjugatingly assertive in her business. Being the quintessential top dog, by throwing her weight around, it made her feel validated. Possibly living on her own, she got rather lonely, so dictatorially laying down the law gave her a feeling of significance. You better watch yourself, Lynn warned me. If you're late again, you're out, Heather. I'm warning you. It's so great having you working here. You're the best florist we've ever had. The trouble with Miss Bonnet, she means well underneath it all. She's not really a bad person, but she believes if you're late that she's personally being duped or being cheated. She has no comprehension of the challenges we face every day to get to work on time. She's very old school in her thinking, fastidiously set in her ways, I'm afraid. Then it happened, and I knew that I was running late for work. There was not a jot I could do about it. It was one of those days when I didn't really have a valid excuse for running late at all. I guess I got out of bed the wrong side, and after that everything spiralled out of control, in the way that invariably always does. Little did I know that the wisest thing I could possibly do was to stay in bed, as things on this day would take a menacing turn that would leave an indelible imprint on my life. I managed to get my kids to school on time, but I was only wearing a tracksuit, so I needed to get home to get dressed. Then I struggled to find anything to wear. By the time I got into my SUV to go to the florist's, let's just say I knew that today was the day that I would lose my job. I climbed into my truck. I was already 15 minutes late, and I hadn't even got there yet. I had a huge lump at the back of my throat. My stomach muscles were clenching tightly and churning. I could feel the nausea rising up in the back of my throat and taste the bitter bile on the back of my tongue. I knew that my excuse today would not cut it with Miss Bonnet. I could not pull the wool over that formidable woman's eyes. The other 2 times I was late I had rather good excuses, and that had not been satisfactory enough for Miss Bonnet. But this time I had no excuse for my apathy or dawdling or procrastination, so I tried to think quickly on my feet about what I should say to her to excuse my lateness, but nothing seemed appropriate. The age-old adage, the dog ate my kids' homework, would never wash with the likes of Miss Bonnet. Even if I told her I had to rush my kid to accident and emergency, she would probably not bat an eyelid, so I truly didn't know what I would say. I parked in the parking bay at the back of the florist, dashing out of my SUV as fast as I possibly could, slamming the car door behind me. I dashed hurriedly to the glass door of the florist. Who should be standing there in the doorway but Miss Bonnet herself? Let's just say she looked like a vulture waiting to pounce on a bloody carcass with her sharp talons, and I was that carcass. She had her hands resting defiantly on her hips. If looks could kill, she was wearing that murderous, reproachful look in her button-brown eyes that seemed incensed.
I remember thinking in that moment that this thin, scraggly woman looked exactly like a voucher. It certainly helped that she had a beak-shaped nose. I could discern that the cantankerous, disagreeable woman was quite literally seething. Her oval jaw was clenched so tightly, I was almost certain she was grinding her teeth. "Good morning, Heather dear," she said sarcastically. "Or should we say good afternoon? Now pray tell me." She paused for a moment. "Now let's see. Did your dog get a lizard stuck in his throat this morning? Or did your daughter throw up all over her dress? Now what is your excuse this time? Or has the cat got your tongue?" "None of that, Miss Bonnet," I said with a pleading, beseechful expression on my face. Miss Bonnet led me into her office. It was a smart room, where she often saw clients when they came to discuss flowers for weddings, funerals, or special occasions. The office was remarkably clean, meticulous. The oakwood desk gleamed. I was almost hesitant to sit down on the ostentatious chairs. They were so grand, upholstered in a very sumptuous, grandiose, velvety fabric. "Sit down," said Mrs. Bonnet, looking at me with a steely gaze, with eyes so penetrating that made me shiver uneasily. "I'm very disappointed in you, Heather. You're 25 minutes late today. Now what do you have to say for yourself, young lady?" I hung my head in shame, feeling like a schoolgirl, again explaining my atrocious behaviour to the teacher. "Miss Bonnet, I truly am sorry about being late. I really am. I'd love to say that the dog ate my kids' homework, but that didn't happen," I said, trying to add some humour to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the room that was so claustrophobic it was cloying. I felt like a conspicuous mouse, trapped and being rounded up by the nasty household cat that had no intentions of dealing with me kindly. I was not going to leave this place unscathed without being pummelled alive by some very sharp claws, and humiliated and shamed in the process. The look on Mrs. Bonnet's thunderous face became increasingly more overcast, rather like a sky that's about to rumble with thunder and flash with lightning strikes. I watched her thin mouth turn downwards into a deep scowl. "You think you're being funny, Heather? You think you can joke about things like this, do you? You're recklessly irresponsible. You think it's no big deal arriving to work late, is that it? Do you know I take a dim view of people arriving to work late? You know what this means, Heather?" It was my mouth this time that turned down into a scowl, while my blue eyes filled with tears. "Miss Bonnet," I pleaded, "I really love my job here at the florist. In truth, it's saved my life. It really has. It's given me an escapism from my children. I find it a fabulous creative outlet where I can express myself. I meet so many wonderful people here. I've made many of our customers terribly happy here with my arrangements. I've also developed great relationships with people." "Well, if you love your job, Heather, then you should have looked after it, shouldn't you? Like anything you care about. But if you failed on 3 occasions to arrive at work on time, I have no option but to tell you to leave today," she said, scribbling down my cheque and handing it to me. "That's what I owe you in your wages. I'm sorry, Heather, that it's come to this, but I have no choice in this matter." "But you can't do this," I protested. "It's not fair. It's wrong. It's unethical." "I think you will find I can do this," said Miss Bonnet. "It's in my terms and agreements that if you're late 3 times after 3 warnings, I can ask you to leave. I'm in my right to sack you, and I have." I pulled the chair away from the desk and tore up Miss Bonnet's cheque in disgust, throwing the pieces into her face defiantly, my eyes filling with tears, but my anger rising up inside me like the waves of a tempestuous sea. I could feel that my tongue was wagging like the feisty sails of a large boat, blowing rambunctiously in the wind. I blurted out what needed saying, perhaps what others before me may have failed to say, but this contemptuous, narrow-minded woman needed to hear some home truths, which might be a bitter pill for her to have to swallow, but they needed saying nevertheless. "You know what your problem is, Miss Bonnet? You're a sad little old lady who hasn't got anything better to do with her life than make people's lives miserable. I know why you do it. You love the feeling of superiority, don't you? It gives you that feeling that you can belittle people. It makes you feel important. Now, I'm an adult, Miss Bonnet. You treat me like a silly baby. If I say I'm going to be late, it is because I have a legitimate reason for being late.
You have fired dozens of girls here, for the very same reason you're firing me today. Doesn't it show you that in people's busy lives you can be late? There can be traffic jams, all kinds of credible reasons why people can't get to work on time. You don't know what the word reasonable means, do you, Miss Bonnet? You're a dragon, a bully. Frankly, not a very nice person. Have you not got bigger fish to fry than worry about your staff being late by a few minutes? It's pathetic, it really is pathetic. My being 15 minutes late does not impede my work in any way. Look at the fabulous flower arrangements I've done for you. Irrespective of what you may say about me, you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone with my skills. But there you go, Miss Bonnet. It's your loss. I'm leaving now, but I'll say this about you. You're not the sharpest brick in the box, for an astute businesswoman would know that laying me off would be a huge loss to the business. But not you. No, not you at all. For you, everything is about timekeeping, when what you should be ultimately worrying about is work quality and how proficient your staff are with your clients. Good day, Miss Bonnet. Have a good life, and I hope it's a happy one. At that I marched out of the shop and dashed to the parking lot, climbing into my truck. I began to drive away. I was so belligerently angry I could feel the blood boiling in my veins. I wanted to hit something very hard, really hard, to get out my fury, as I'd never been worked up into such a frenzy before. Sometimes I found that driving out into the countryside tended to take the edge off my anger. It helped to soothe my troubled, inflamed soul. In the past, if I became exasperated by a bunch of screaming kids, a drive in the countryside helped, but nothing was working today. I was growing more and more incensed with the audacious impertinence of Miss Bonnet. Why was she such an unreasonable woman? Why could she not judge me on the quality of my work, the way I deal with my customers? My being late by a few minutes had never affected my business whatsoever. It wasn't like I was a flight attendant working for an international flight and had to clock in on the dotted line. This was incredibly different. I knew finding another part-time job 3 times a week, doing something I love like this, was never going to be easy. I drew to the side of the road and texted my husband Ted. Just been sacked. I was late for the 3rd time. Tried to reason with Miss Bonnet, but she wouldn't listen. A text returned to me. The woman is unreasonable. Very sorry, love. I'm sure you will find another job very soon. You're a very proficient hard worker. It's her loss and your gain. I tried to text him back, but the screen went blank. Damn, I thought. I'd forgotten to charge my phone. This day was getting progressively worse and worse, second by second, minute by minute. I didn't have a charger with me, so my phone would be out of action for a while. I groaned, finding a part-time job like this again. One that I loved was not going to be easy. This job had been perfect for me, and jobs like this, especially part-time ones, did not grow on trees or dangle on marble fireplaces like Christmas stockings. As I was reflecting over these thoughts, driving in the countryside, admiring the exquisite views from my window, a white SUV came right up behind me and started hooting at me, as if to say, "Hurry up there." For me, that was like the trigger to my hypothetical rifle. I was now blazing with fury. I had just lost my job, and some loser out there on the road had the brazen audacity to honk his horn at me. How dare he? I was going at the right speed limit. He was the one in the wrong, speeding and hooting at me, for ostensibly I was not even breaking the law. He had a bloody cheek, I thought. My feathers were now fully ruffled. If he wanted to fight, I thought furiously, then he's got one. I'll show him that I'm no pushover. I put my foot on the accelerator and passed his truck, giving him the finger and sticking out my tongue at him. It was probably a childish, juvenile and churlish thing to do, but I really didn't care. It had felt strangely good, oddly cathartic, as if I'd let go of some inner angst and turmoil. After all, was I not entitled to let go of some of that steam? Especially after what I'd been through this morning. I was to learn that sticking my tongue out at him, blowing my horn, giving him an FU sign with my finger, was a very bad idea. A very bad idea indeed. Normally I would never behave in such a bold, bellicose, antagonistic way. but I was in a bad, pugnacious mood. My inhibitions had melted away, rather like the butter on a bagel. I had behaved in an inappropriate way that was contrary to my character. I had inadvertently blown caution to the wind. I had absolutely no idea that winding up this threatening stranger was the worst thing I could possibly have done, for I was to find out that this contentious, confrontational character was not the kind of man you rubbed up the wrong way, for he definitely had a chip on his shoulder. As I whizzed past the cantankerous, captious driver in my SUV, I felt momentarily victorious, letting out a rather happy whoop. Whoop! Raising my hands up in self-congratulations. I'll show you, I thought, feeling rather proud of myself for being so assertive. But my pride soon dissipated, and that brief moment of satisfaction waned like a groaning wind blowing on a different course, letting out a disagreeable whistle. I could tell by the atrocious way the man was driving behind me that he was as mad as hell and was out for revenge. He began to ram into the back of my SUV 3 repetitive times. Bang, bang, bang. They were forceful bumps. He was honking his horn at me very loudly. Regretfully, there were no other cars on the road, so I felt incredibly isolated, alone, daunted and overwhelmed by this ambiguous predator in tireless pursuit of me. I pushed my foot down on the accelerator to speed up. The man began to speed up. He rammed his truck into the rear side of my SUV over and over again. Looking through my visor window, I could tell that the rear end of my car had taken a huge lashing. The back had buckled up significantly. This man was completely insane. He began honking his horn at me, zigzagging down the road in treacherous, precarious, highly dangerous manoeuvres that showed me that this peevish, truculent person was prepared to use his truck on me as a deadly weapon. I was being pursued by him. He meant business. I knew he was out for the kill, like a lion hot on the trail of a deer. This man was resolutely determined. He would stop at nothing until he'd beaten the very life out of me and left me for dead. How I knew this I don't know, but I certainly did. I felt it in the core of my gut. "Oh my God!" I cried out aloud in my car. "What the heck do I do? What do I do? My cell phone's not working right now." I started to speed up with his truck racing behind me. I knew that I was seriously in trouble, as this angry man was out to get me. He was sticking his finger up out of the window and making these horrendous signs at me. The monster began chasing me down the mountain roads of West Virginia. In truth, I didn't have a clue where I was. I had lost all sense of direction. And without a working GPS, let's just say I wasn't in a particularly good place. I knew I was definitely lost. Every turn I took was literally a perilous risk. All I needed to do was to get away from this brutish man. But how? That was the question. I began to drive down a sandy road, with him ambushing me from behind, while I kept watching his outrageous, reckless twists and turns in the visor mirror. If I had not known any better, I would say he was driving like an intoxicated drunk, trailing behind me. But what I failed to realize was that the road had reached a dead end, so inadvertently I was rather trapped. There was a small clearing that branched out into a sprawling wood grove that was made up of red maples, sugar maples, red budwoods and oaks. Beyond that there was nothing else, only an ocean of trees, and still more trees, moving their boughs in the soft breeze, under the vast canopy of a very blue sky, without a fluffy cloud in sight. When I'd realized I'd reached this dead end and could not actually turn around my car without the man whizzing up to my rear with his engine accelerating, I quickly put my SUV into park, climbing out of the car, and I began to hightail it into the woods, thanking God for one day in my life when I was actually wearing sneakers, because I had been in a hurry this morning. Most days of the week I tended to wear the most impractical shoes, which would have been a death wish this morning. My heart was pounding violently in my ears as I ran across the clearing that was peppered with tufts of long grass, rocks, occasional wild flowers, and rambunctious weeds that were growing like little cactuses through the earthen floor. I sensed the place was rather remote and off the beaten track, not really the kind of place you would encounter a living soul. I could hear the man's truck grinding to a sudden stop. His tires began to skid on the granular surface of the road, making a discomposing noise. He slammed the truck door behind him. Then I heard shots being fired after me. My heart began to race, thundering through my chest. All I could think is, oh my God, this maniac is going to kill me, and get away with it too. The fear surged through my veins. My legs increased in speed. I deliberately zigzagged towards the woods as the shots were being fired after me. Boom, boom, boom. Believe me, there were a few near misses. "I'll get you, you bloody bitch," came a man's thunderous voice. I was breathing heavily. My mind was in a whirl. My life flashed before my eyes. It would seem that losing my job with Miss Bonnet was pie in the sky now, compared to the pickle I found myself enduring. I knew that the only way I could survive being attacked or killed by this ghastly, morose man was to find a good hiding place, to keep my head together. I couldn't afford to panic under any circumstances. That would be my ruination. As I entered the woodgrove, the tall, burly, wide, substantial trees penciled up into the sky like spectacular, imposing, verdant giants, their boughs generously covered in a plethora of leaves. The forest sparkled with a dewy, viridescent green. The sunlight danced through the branches, dappling everything in a soft, ethereal light. Even as I ran, I could smell the rich earthen floor, the bouquet of wild flowers on the wind. I could feel the beauty of this place as curvaceous tree trunks, rocks, broken forest debris were swathed resplendently in rich, sumptuous carpets of luxurious green moss. Then there were ferns with lacy, bountiful leaves spread out like open umbrellas. The ground cover on the forest floor was bountifully prolific, but where to hide, that was the vexing conundrum. I decided to conceal myself behind a large tree trunk rather than leave myself vulnerable to being caught in a compromising position where I could be ambushed and unable to escape. I stood very still, hardly daring to breathe, as the man finally entered the woodgrove. I could hear him as he thundered forwards, stomping on his feet like a belligerent bull, relentlessly pursuing a matador's red flag. No prizes for guessing who was that red flag. I was beginning to breathe very heavily. My heart could not stop pounding. It was loud in my ears. I was terrified that this man would find me simply by hearing my fear, for it had a frequency, I was sure of that could definitely be discerned. I took a quick peek at him from the corner of my tree. My God, he was possibly the most intimidating man that I'd ever seen. He was built like a machine, as if he spent his lifetime working out in a gym, pounding weights. He was strong, cold-blooded, mean-looking. I suspected he was such an angry character that punching a boxing bag at the gym and lifting some insanely heavy weights was his way of letting off steam. But today I was about to be his punching bag. He was wearing a string vest, so his sizable muscles were fully on display. He was heavily inked. His bald head was covered with a red bandana, but his face was contorted in the ugliest, most rageful expression. I could swear that there was foam emanating from his mouth like a rabid dog. "I know you're here, young lady. You're not going to get away with what you've done. Nobody treats me with such contempt. No one who does that escapes my wrath. Do you hear that, young lady? No one escapes my wrath. I saw you giving me the finger, sticking out your tongue at me, back there on the road. You are not getting away with this today. You are going to beg me for your life. I'm not in an agreeable mood, so you'll have to do a whole lot of begging." He laughed out loud, as if he was applauding himself by his pernicious humour. He smirked, and then unloaded a couple more bullets, firing them up into the air. Oh my God, I thought. He had something that ominously looked like a machine gun in his hands, like the rifles that they use in war movies, although I know nothing about ammunition. I knew this man could potentially kill me. I would be one of those dead bodies uncovered in the woods, whose murderer was never found. A duplicitous case of road rage gone horribly wrong. A large man who fancied himself as the Terminator was now in pursuit of me, listening attentively to every sound. One moment he walked past me and was so close I could literally reach out and touch him, but thank God he never saw me. I could smell the stench of his sweat. It infused the air with a pungent, obnoxious odour. Until now the forest had been pleasantly peaceful, filled with a pretty chorus of birdsong.
but then the birdsong simply dissipated, as if someone had switched off the music centre in your living room.
It became ominously quiet. Indeed, things were so quiet that my pounding heart seemed louder than the silence. I was petrified that this man would hear my breathing, for my internal rhythms, such as my breathing and heartbeat, appeared louder than this silence. The man was walking around the place searching for me. For some reason he'd sensed I hadn't gone deeper into the woods. How he discerned this I couldn't fathom. Then he saw me. He let out a huge, manic, rapturous roar, like an untamed predatory wild animal, a sound which travelled far and wide through the wood-grove with a powerful echo that could not be dismissed. I began to scream, "Get away from me! Don't come near me! Get away! Get away!"
"Oh, what will you do to me?" he said, looking at me through his narrowing, guileful eyes that looked terribly pleased with himself. "You'll stick out your tongue at me? Give me the finger, will you? I don't think so. Look at you. You're pathetic. Not so cocky now, are you, girl? Go away. Leave me alone. Go away. You're crazy. There's something seriously wrong with you. You're sick in the head." In that moment I thought this vindictive man was going to shoot me. But no, this man had other ideas. Shooting me was far too easy. He wanted to inflict pain on me first. He wanted me to suffer, to get exactly what I deserved. I could see his intentions in his eyes. A murderous, revengeful look that wants to inflict massive suffering. I tried to run. I really did. But I was no match for this man. I was slight, small, petite. He was big and strong. As I ran, I felt his huge hand grabbing me from behind. He toppled me over onto the ground, so I fell backwards onto the earthen floor. He crawled above me, his calloused, roughed hands clasped around my neck. His furious, enraged face flushed bright pink. He began to squeeze my neck tightly. "How does this feel, you bitch?" he said, staring into my eyes with a measure of satisfied pleasure. I was fighting back with all my might, twisting and contorting my body, but this man held me down with a mighty, powerful force, upon which I was rendered helpless. Then redemption came my way. I heard this booming sound. It sounded like something ponderous, big and mighty was thundering in the forest. Then there he was, proud, tall, lofty, majestic, inquisitive. This titanic-sized creature stood still, watching the man intently, who had his hands clasped around my neck. But the man, upon beholding the creature, suddenly released his tight hold from me, consumed by astonishment. I don't believe for a moment he could comprehend what he was seeing, but he certainly discerned that this creature staring at him through his deep-set dark eyes was a potential threat. I choked and spluttered as he released his grip from me, finally being able to draw in fresh air. It was such a relief to be able to breathe again. I hastily sat up also to see the creature. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot. It was clear to see by the discernment in his wise eyes that he had a pretty good idea what was going on. There is no doubt in my mind that he was quick-witted, sharp, intuitive, highly perceptive, and terribly kind. He had the loveliest eyes I've ever seen. I knew this creature would help me, save me even. I was absolutely certain of it. I cried out to the Bigfoot, who had a human-like face. "You see this man over here? He's trying to kill me. Please help me. Please help me." For a second the Bigfoot's deep-set dark eyes were pinned on me. He seemed to listen to my words, as though meditating on what I was saying. As weird as it may sound, he comprehended my pleas. I know he did. The man got to his feet and began babbling. "This woman, she's trouble." He reached for his rifle, which was clear his intention was to use on the Bigfoot. But it was too late, for the Bigfoot had read his thoughts before he could even act them out with his rifle. The Bigfoot bounded forward with his feet now standing on the man's rifle, so he was unable to retrieve it. His dark eyes were staring down at the man, whose eyes had grown round with terror. The Bigfoot's lips rolled back to reveal large human-like teeth. He began to growl at the man. It was a deep, low, guttural growl. It was a terrifying sound, and with his gnashes showing, let's just say he looked ferocious.
The petrified man tried to get up on his feet and ran backwards, but the Bigfoot pushed him backwards so that he fell over, and the Bigfoot held him down with one arm. He went stumbling onto the ground. The man whom previously had impressed me by his size was now dwarfed and intimidated by this gargantuan creature, who made him look inconspicuous, tiny, and honestly quite pathetic. I remember even thinking that next to the Bigfoot he looked so fragile, as if he would easily break, like a fine piece of bone china. The man was screaming, even calling out to me for help, but I was not going to stick my neck out for him, for this man was duplicitous and untrustworthy.
Shoot him! Shoot him, you bitch! Shoot him! The rifle's over there on the ground! Get it! Shoot him! The bloody Bigfoot is going to kill me, can't you see?
Like you were going to kill me a moment before. I'm sorry, but I have no sympathy for your plight. You deserve everything you get. I'm sorry. The next thing I knew was that the Bigfoot reached for the rifle. He began to beat the man's head with it. He screamed, "No! No! No!" his oscillating arms fiercely fighting back. But he was no match for the Bigfoot. The man became silent, his body limp and lifeless. His glazed eyes seemed to stare vacantly into space. Truly, I felt no empathy for this man. What the Bigfoot did next was exceedingly bizarre. He pulled out the man's tongue, out from his mouth. Then he sat down on the earthen ground and began to eat it, as if it was a delicacy. Then he even tore off a piece for me, as if to say, "Would you like some?" He did offer it to me. I was shocked and shook my head vigorously, unable to stop staring at the creature as he ate the human tongue. It seemed quite chewy. I knew I was in no danger. The creature had saved my life, and as he ate the tongue he chattered away garrulously to me in a language that I did not comprehend, as if I was his very good friend, all the while looking at me through animated brown eyes that made me naturally like him. I stared at him in complete, total and utter awe. "Why?" I asked him. "Why are you eating a man's tongue?" I heard the words in my mind. "He used his tongue for evil. I'm using it for good. It tastes very good. Tongues are delicious. I'm not going to let a good thing go to waste." Did I really hear him say that, I wondered. "I better go," I told him, getting up onto my feet. The Bigfoot smacked his lips together. He got up. I heard him say in my head, "I'll see you safely out of the woods." I looked up at him for a moment. He looked down at me. I realized he was easily over 8 foot tall, possibly between 600 and 700 pounds, covered in long flowing hair on his body, a tortoiseshell colour with mixed varied shades, rather like those unusual cats you get. I walked through the woods with the Bigfoot by my side, climbing into my truck, being able to manoeuvre around the dead man's vehicle. The Bigfoot all the while watched me as I drove. I quickly raised my hand towards him to wave at him. He did the same with me, nodding his head. I returned the compliment. Then I drove away. I never told anyone about the dead body in the woods, or what had happened to me. It was my secret after all, that I never intended to share with a single soul. I'm sure I'm not alone in harbouring a secret like this. I never found out who the man was that died, but trust me, the world is a better place without him. He was evil to his core, and if I'd saved his life, he would have turned around and killed me. I know that to be a fact. Needless to say, after my harrowing experience in the wood, I didn't care about losing my job at the florist. Somehow it seemed inconsequential in the great scheme of things. A week after I'd left the florist, I got a visit from Miss Bonnet. When I opened the door of my home to see her standing there, I had half a mind to slam it back in her face. But she pushed the door open with her hands, asking me if she might have a chat with me for a moment. "Fine," I said, shrugging my shoulders, leading the woman into the kitchen, while boiling her a hot cup of tea. I knew Miss Bonnet drank tea only. "I've come here to apologise," she said. "You were absolutely right. I was exceedingly unreasonable. I guess I've been unreasonable all my life. Maybe, like you say, I am a sad old woman. But I do hope I'm not a dragon or a bully. You see, growing up as a young girl, my father was punctilious. He believed being late was the height of rudeness, was grossly unacceptable. I think it was ingrained in my psyche that lateness of any kind was not acceptable. But times have changed significantly. Life's got a lot busier these days. People's lives are wrought with issues. But living on my own, I failed to realise this. You, my dear, made me take a long, hard look at myself. I hate to admit it to you. I didn't like what I was seeing. What I've clearly become. Miss Bonnet had tears in her eyes. I reached out to comfort her. I'm sorry, I said. I was gutted when you sacked me. I didn't mean to lash out at you in the way I did. I deserved it, my dear. I really did. Needless to say, all my customers are exceedingly outraged that I've sacked you. I can't say I blame them. They're saying that they will not be ordering any flowers from me unless I reinstate you immediately. You see, my dear, my customers adore you. You were right. You've got heaps of talent, so losing you is very bad for business. I can see that now. What are you saying, Mrs. Bonnet? I'm saying, if you'll accept your job back, I would be delighted if you would return. But what about if I'm late, Miss Bonnet? Because I will be late again, possibly many more times. I can't go through all that aggro again. I don't care if you're late, my dear. I care about the quality of your work. That's the only thing that's important. I'm glad to tell you that I've worked for Miss Bonnet for many years, and then she handed over her florist to me when she retired. Never once did she ever accuse me of being late again. So maybe a leopard can change their spots. As for the Bigfoot, I do think of him often. I've thought of him a lot over the years. I'm ever grateful that he saved my life and that he listened to my pleas. I'm certain that obnoxious man would almost certainly have killed me. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Max, and I have an extraordinary letter that was written by a lady called Emma, who was writing to her sister Eugenie in the days of coal mining in West Virginia in the 1800s. It would appear that Eugenie left the coal mining business to marry an affluent gentleman living in the Midwest. I have a feeling that Eugenie is an ancestor of mine, which is why I do have her sister's letter that she wrote to her, which I kept for many years as it was a huge source of fascination for me when I stumbled across it by random chance as a young boy. I kept it because in her letter she describes an extraordinary encounter with a mythical beast which I really believe was a Bigfoot. It would seem that Eugenie's father owned a coal mine, and she describes her revulsion at how the locals were actually treated by her own father. It would seem she had a compassionate heart, but felt disabled as a young woman at the time to have her voice heard in regards to helping right the dreadful wrongs and exploitations that the miners invariably experienced. Working in a coal mine was doing the hardest, most dangerous job in the entire world, which involved hauling coal and using dangerous explosives in the mine to bring down the coal, a mission that in its day was not without grievous risk. So here is her extraordinary letter that she wrote her sister Eugenie, which includes a Bigfoot encounter that leads her to the revelation that she cannot marry her suitor because she realizes he hasn't got a backbone at all. So here is the story. To my dearest, most beloved sister Eugenie. Eugenie, my sweet, precious, most beloved sister, how dreadfully missed you have been by all of us of late. Our home without doubt feels lost and forlorn without its precious songbird. It would seem that without your cheerful countenance, our mansion lacks the sunshine you always bring to our lives, something that has become painfully apparent to all of us, now that you have gone to pastures new. Oh, how I long to see you, Eugenie, my precious, most beloved sister. You indeed have my whole heart. Even Papa has less of a skip in his step these days, and as for Mamma, her face is forever downcast, and she speaks always of the hole in her heart now that you have gone away. I hope that your new life in the Midwest is indeed favouring you well, and that the barren landscape does not dishearten your spirit. Moreover, I hope that the treacherous summer heat has not been a hindrance to the preservation of your perfect pale complexion. I hope that your husband is treating you favourably in a manner of your worth, and that married life does become you. For my dear sweet Eugenie, you deserve the bounty of life's abundant treasures and the greatest happiness of its rich tapestry that it can bestow upon you. I hope in the days to come that we may hear word on the wind from the Midwest of the pitter-patter of tiny little feet soon to cross the threshold of your new sumptuous abode. I hold this hope in my heart like a bright beacon of light, that I may soon become an aunt in the foreseeable future, as such news would be warmly welcomed in my heart. Papa is still up to his old insidious tricks again at the coal mine. It's apparent that he cares not for the people nestled under his wings, nor does he take any responsibility for their sorry plight. He comprehends not the toilsome labours and arduous workloads of the miners, and is not aggrieved by the perils they face daily underground, especially when ceilings are low and accidents more likely to occur. The miners did demand of him an increased wage, and he agreed to this advancement. I hasten to say that so treacherous was Papa that he spiked the prices up in the company stores to make up for the shortfall of the wage increase. The miners are indeed no better off than they were before, and yet our Papa considers himself a virtuous man of God in this shameful, appalling exploitation of his workers. It is beyond reprehensible what he has done. Yet when I registered my misgivings about his devious actions and protested indignantly, he proceeded to tell me that I knew not the ways of business, and that my young brain was better served to focusing on the trivia of more feminine pursuits, and not to concern myself with the issues of the mine. How can I not be concerned, Eugenie dear? For when I look outside my luxurious balcony windows overlooking the mine, I see the young and old faces blackened by the coal dust and the sweat that beats upon their brows. I observe the long arduous hours that they work, and the perilous risks they face. I also hear the rumbling of the mine every day, and the loud explosions from beneath the ground, and all of this I observe and see every day. How can my eyes be blinded by what I observe, for that would make me have the hide of a crocodile. I have taken it upon myself to visit the many households of the miners, as I want to express my empathy towards their plight, and show them that not all our family is ignorant of their sufferings. It is hard to fathom how these people of such pleasing countenance live in these small miners' cabins that are far from agreeable, and even my closet, Eugenie, is of greater width and depth than their own tiny houses. It unsettles me and disturbs me greatly to see a family of 8 squashed into such tiny living quarters. Many of them are in debt to Papa at the company store, and struggle to even put food on the table to feed their families. I so wish Papa could forgive their debts with all my heart, as it would be of no real bother to his pocket, yet for them the relief would be a blessing of note. Despite the grievous injustices the miners have invariably faced, not to mention their rising debt and expenses incurred at Papa's company store, these resilient folk still remain upbeat and positive, with an attitude of merriment and good humour, always spinning yarns and singing songs, especially down in the mines. I was to learn that the miners always joke and tell tales of devilish apparitions that they encounter in the hole. How can they be so jovial in spirit, given grievous evils that have befallen them? If it were indeed me, I would not be so generous of heart in my forgiveness of Papa. Yet these miners sing and dance and help each other in every regard, and treat their friends as family. I know they are indeed aggrieved by the struggles their daily lives proliferate, but they are still in good spirits, and the young men are forever taught to grin through the wretchedness of the mine, and shine like men in their countenance, despite the dreads they face, for each day hangs in the balance for them, and that is indeed truly the case. Let's not forget to mention the pitiful complications of the black coal dust that does indeed clog their lungs and cause a shallowness of breath, for many have died in this regard, a manner of death that I would not wish on anyone. Yet still Papa refuses any incriminations on their account, and knows no commiseration in his heart for their sorrowful woes, for he cares not for their lives, and values them not. I think a herd of cattle would be of more value to him. For indeed many a miner has lost his life from the explosions in the mine, and many a man has succumbed to a brutal injury, like a loss of a limb or eye, as you well know. I was informed that a fortnight after a widow learns about her husband's tragic demise, that our Papa demands her to leave forthwith with her children after such a tragic grief. How can he have in his heart the hardness of solid rocks, and in his mind the fleece of a sheep? For he perceives not the frightful truth of these grave injustices, which I think only God will bring to his attention on the day of our Lord's reckoning. I met a young lady called Violet, whose husband had passed from an explosion a day ago. Her heart was swollen with grief, and her eyes reddened by tears of her turbulent sorrows. I took it upon myself to find her work and lodgings, to accommodate her family, and her gratitude knew no bounds, for she hugged me without restraint, and my heart quickened in delight. I was pleased to have been of service to the poor woman, upon whom my soul surely grieves, for indeed her sorry most wretched plight I would not wish upon any man. Yet let us not deceive ourselves with thoughts that gladden our hearts, lest we should hear the bitter truth. For Eugenie, it is common here in the mines for souls to indeed be lost, much more so than Papa will ever concede to us. For the astonishing stories I hear of late from those miners' wives are too pitiful for words to express, and they confirm my worst fears of the dreadful casualties in the mine that Papa concealeth from us. So put it in your imagination, Eugenie, for deep consideration and reflection, what I have indeed told you. Another gloomy, restless thought that beats upon my brow and disturbs my peace with feelings of grave concern are for those mules taken into the depths of those dark mines, their bodies burdened by the carts carrying the coal backwards and forwards into the bosom of the mine, with no time to rest their weary legs. For they spend days cloaked in the darkness and the gloom of the mine. How unnatural for the poor mules to succumb to the terrifying explosive sounds of the rumbling mine, and be cushioned from the light of day that quickens their eyes to the perils of physical blindness. Papa cares not for the woeful impediment of the animals, as he cares not for the state of the miners. What I have learnt of late is that all the other mine owners are equally as greedy of gaining wealth, as their crowning glory, at the exploitation of the miners that work for them. It is in my understanding that they all have their own company stores and in-house currencies, much like Papa does, and they care not for anyone apart from their pocketbooks, increasing in weight, and some indeed are worse than Papa, if that were indeed possible, in their ravenous pursuit of this goal. I instructed the miners to tell my father that 3 of the mules had lost air in the mine shaft and had indeed suffocated, and that was when I took the mules to a farmer's field, where I paid them handsomely to take care of the animals for the rest of their days. Upon my visit to the mules a few days later did I discover joy in their eyes, as the sun beat upon their bodies, and they rolled and frolicked in the field, and their happiness was beyond measure. So grateful were they to be away from such a harrowing job, which no animal should have to endure. It is my decision that I will ever help every mule that works in those mines. Indeed, after a year of work, I will consider her to have paid her due, and to be set free and from her hardened labour, and of this decision Father must never ever be informed or enlightened. I've recently been courted by the Phillips boy Matthew, as I imagine you still expected to be the case. He has a heart on him as hard as Papa's is, as his soul is so intent on the pursuit of rich pickings, which seems to be a common goal among all the men I meet. I was to learn this with deep regret when I suggested we went on a picnic together to the wooded area near the ridge, where the crooked oak tree stands, opposite the meandering stream, on the right-hand side of the valley. You know the one where we played hide-and-seek as children. It was a pleasing picnic, but I think less to his liking than mine, for the cloth I spread upon the ground was rather too uncomfortable for his soft derriere to abide. It would seem in his lavish cushioned lifestyle he has only ever graced the seat of upholstered chairs, and sitting on the ground was not in agreement with his awkward vertical stature. Even so, he held his countenance in a pleasing and agreeable manner, and hid his displeasure from me, proving to be a gentleman of sorts. We sat and ate our fill, and the meal was pleasing to his appetite. While we were eating under the large oak tree in the woods, it came upon my attention that we were indeed not alone, for I felt with certainty that we were being stared at, but I could see no one in sight. I was also quick to note that Matthew's countenance had taken on a pale pallor, and he had grown exceedingly anxious. He pretended all was well, but even his laughter seemed to have subsided, and became anguished and painfully disturbed, and his attention was far from me, as his eyes regarded the trees with a fearful repose. It was then that I saw a creature that was unlike anything that I've ever seen in all my born days, for never have I seen a creature so strange grace my life before, with a surprise of note. For although the creature looked like a man, it was not a man, and yet it was not an animal either. What it was, I cannot fathom. A giant it was indeed, and colossal in its girth and its size and stature, and it was hefty in its weight. Like a bear, the body was covered in hair, but textured not like that of a bear, but more human-like in its origins. It was a favourable golden colour that was pleasing to the eye. Its face grew no hair, and was of a grey leather, and its nose and jaw were much like yours and mine. But the ridge on its forehead was prominent and furrowed with a great depth. His head was not of human shape, but more like that of an egg, pointed on top, and at the bottom wider in dimension, to be sure. I noted with a keen interest that the head indeed flowed into the shoulders, where no neck was visible. The creature had arms that were so long he could have almost touched his toes, and his feet and hands were indeed very large to behold. It was the deep-set eyes that were so bright and gold that had my attention ordered, for what I was seeing did amplify my awe, and my fascination was indeed aroused. The creature stepped forward out of the shadows into the light, and his reticent shyness was now of the past, for he regarded us with an equal interest. It would seem that Matthew was filled with panic as he began to shake in terror, and I did behold his eyes were round with fright, and his body wobbled like a blamage. In that moment he knew no regard for me, and a gentleman he most certainly was not, for he ran away as fast as the lions upon the mountain, and he screamed with a shrillness that was deafening to the ear. I was left alone, standing close to this strange creature I knew not. But I felt no fear, for it was not unkindly disposed towards me, but more playful in its demeanour and approach. The expression upon his face was that of mischief. It glided towards my picnic that lay upon the ground, and rifled through all the food in the wicker basket, with an eagerness that was comical, for the creature was indeed of great humour. It found the fruit and ate with great delight, and the stewed peaches and strawberries gladdened his heart, and the rich fruit cake was his prize, for that he ate with gusto. The creature put the empty wicker basket upon his head, and so funny was the look that my laughter could not subside, and he seemed pleased by my pleasure, for I believe a natural comic he was born to be. I liked him more than words can express, for he warmed the cockles of my heart like no other, apart from you, Eugenie dear. He then bolted away for a moment, and came back, and in my hand he placed a stone, so pretty in its colour, as it had hints of turquoise and gold in its depths. He looked into my eyes as he gave me this gift, and I shall not forget his kindness. In the distance the voices of men were heard, armed with rifles, for indeed Matthew had told them that I was surely dead, ravaged by a wild animal, hungry for my blood. And yet he had run away, leaving me to die. So a gentleman he most certainly was not. I told the men the creature had been dealt with, and that I was fine, and they believed my false report, for I wanted to protect the animal at every cost. Matthew was pleased to see me alive, and indeed asked my papa for permission to marry me. But I told papa that a cowardly man I must surely refuse, and papa did not disagree with my persuasions, which was for me a great relief. I had thought he would press upon me heavily to marry Matthew, but he didn't, I am glad to say. So, Eugenie dear, I will not be betrothed to Matthew, as you believed I would. I have seen him in a brand new light. But do not be disheartened, sister dear, for the time will come when I find the right suitor for me. I am sorry to unload these burdens of mine upon your ears, but I wanted to share with you my grievances, for you I know will surely understand the issues of the mine that have long concerned us. Please pray for the miners at the mine, and their wives, of course, and that papa will be more lenient towards them.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.